Hello, weary traveller. If you've joined us before, welcome back. You're new. Welcome to tonight's soothing tales from centuries past. Before we begin, as always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. I love seeing where in the world our nocturnal historians are tuning in from. And if you enjoy this kind of soft educational storytelling, please consider subscribing so you don't miss future episodes. Tonight, we're going to embark on a journey back in time to one of the mightiest empires the world has ever known, the Ottoman Empire, spanning over 600 years from the 14th to early 20th centuries, and at its height stretching across 3 continents, from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf to North Africa. This Turkish Muslim dynasty left an indelible mark on the lands it conquered and the millions of subjects under its rule. But life was far from easy for those who called the Ottoman Empire home. From the opulent palaces of Istanbul to the arid villages of Arabia to the war-torn frontier with Europe, hardship and brutality were ever-present realities. Tonight, we'll explore the many challenges, geographic, economic, political, religious, and social, that made life a struggle for so many during this fascinating period. So get settled in, maybe with a warm cup of tea, and let your imagination wander back to a time of sultans and harems, of vast trade networks and clashing civilizations, of piety and persecution, all under the banner of the Crescent and Star. The Ottoman Empire first emerged in the 1300s, rising from the ashes of the once mighty Seljuk Empire in Anatolia. Founded by Osman III, after whom the empire was named, this fledgling state began as just one of many small principalities vying for power in the region. But through a combination of shrewd diplomacy, well-timed conquests, and the weakness of their neighbors, the Ottomans quickly expanded their territory and influence. Key early victories included the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, which subjugated much of the Balkans, and the pivotal Battle of Varna in 1444, where a crusading army of Hungarian and Polish forces was decisively defeated. Yet it was the conquest of the fabled city of Constantinople in 1453 by Mehmed II that truly heralded the Ottomans' arrival as a major power. Rechristened Istanbul, the city became the capital of a flourishing empire that would dominate the Islamic world for centuries to come. At its peak in the 16th century, under the rule of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire was a force to be reckoned with. A master statesman and general, Suleiman presided over the golden age of Ottoman might and prosperity. It was said that he never lost a battle. Under his reign, Ottoman armies pushed deep into Central Europe, conquering Belgrade and most of Hungary. To the east, they captured Baghdad and exercised control over the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Ottoman naval supremacy extended across the Mediterranean as Barbary corsairs allied with the empire terrorized European shipping. The coffee household of Suleiman was legendary for its grandeur, learning, and opulence. Gifted artists and architects were commissioned to decorate the Topkapi Palace with brilliant tilework, plush carpets, ornate calligraphy, and shimmering precious stones. Exotic animals prowled the palace gardens. Hundreds of concubines and eunuchs resided in the labyrinthine harem, with the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, often wielding power behind the scenes. But all this splendor belied the harsh realities of daily life for the Sultan's subjects. For while Suleiman and his court enjoyed unimaginable wealth and luxury, the vast majority of people in the empire lived in grinding poverty and hardship. Perhaps the most obvious challenge for the Ottomans was the sheer size and diversity of their empire. Spanning from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula to the shores of North Africa, the empire encompassed a dizzying array of landscapes, climates, and peoples. Governing such far-flung lands posed immense difficulties. Communication was slow, with messengers on horseback often taking weeks or months to deliver decrees from the capital to distant provinces. travel was arduous and dangerous, whether by rutted road or storm-tossed sea. Maintaining control over unruly local rulers and tribes on the periphery was a constant battle. The empire contained an incredible diversity of terrain, from snow-capped mountains to sun-baked deserts, fertile river valleys to marshy swamps rife with malaria. Droughts, floods, earthquakes, and other natural disasters posed ever-present threats in different regions. Famines periodically ravaged areas where crops failed, leaving thousands to starve. But perhaps no burden was more universally felt than the heavy hand of the Sultan and his officials. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan was an absolute ruler whose word was law. Styling himself as both a temporal ruler and a spiritual leader, he demanded complete obedience from his subjects. For the common people, this often translated into oppression and exploitation. Laws were harsh and punishments severe. Petty crimes like theft could result in a hand being cut off. Apostasy and heresy were punishable by death. Taxes were high and collected mercilessly, with tax farmers squeezing peasants for every last coin. The rich were expected to give lavish gifts to curry favor with the Sultan and his officials. Those who fell out of favor could find their lands and wealth confiscated, their families enslaved or executed. Corruption was endemic, with bribes and patronage, the oil that greased the gears of imperial administration. Most subjects had little access to education or opportunity for social mobility. Women and religious minorities especially faced discrimination. Christians and Jews, while tolerated, had to pay special taxes and face certain restrictions on their rights and freedoms. Many Christian boys from the Balkans were taken from their families in a process called devshirme, to serve as elite Janissary soldiers or administrators forced to convert to Islam. Despite the empire's incredible wealth from trade and conquest, prosperity was far from equally shared. Glittering goods from the east, spices, silk, porcelain, gems, passed through Ottoman lands, but the profits largely flowed to the Sultan and a small mercantile class. For artisans and merchants, life was precarious. Strict guilds controlled who could produce and sell certain goods. The whims of the court, fluctuating prices, foreign competition, wars, and natural disasters could spell ruin. The lifeblood of the Ottoman economy was agriculture, but for the peasants who toiled in the fields, hunger and hardship were constant companions. Most were little more than serfs, bound to the land and to the feudal-like estates of Ottoman officials and cavalry soldiers called sipahis and taimars. Adding to their burden were the saliane, oppressive, irregular taxes levied to pay for military campaigns. In times of crisis, extra crops and livestock might be confiscated to provision the army, leaving little for peasants' families. The Ottoman war machine was fearsome to behold, but no less fearsome was the life of those conscripted to serve in it. Soldiers were expected to show unquestioning loyalty and discipline. Training was brutal, as were conditions on campaign. Marching for months into enemy territory, Ottoman armies faced extremes of heat and cold, drought and downpour. Disease was rampant in crowded military camps. Siege warfare could drag on for months, with soldiers slowly starving or succumbing to dysentery and typhus. Those unlucky enough to garrison frontier forts and outposts faced a life of isolation, deprivation, and the constant threat of bandit raids and enemy assaults. Many men never returned from the distant battlefields of Persia, the Caucasus, and Europe. But there was no shortage of soldiers for the Sultan's wars. Prisoners of war and enslaved people were pressed into service. Tribesmen from the empire's hinterlands were offered land grants in exchange for military service. And of course, there were the Janissaries, Christian captives and conscripts transformed into elite warriors utterly loyal to the Sultan. Throughout the empire, the institution of slavery was deeply entrenched. People were routinely enslaved through conquest, kidnapping, and debt. Slaves toiled in fields and households, served in the army and navy, and of course, populated the imperial harem. For the Sultan's hundreds of concubines, life was a gilded cage of luxury, intrigue, and captivity. Torn from their homelands in Europe, Africa, and the Caucasus, these women schemed and seduced to win status and influence. Bearing a son, a potential heir to the throne, was their surest route to security and power. But harem life was rife with perils. Concubines that fell out of favor could be married off to minor officials or even executed. There were always new rivals to fend off as the Sultan's mother, the powerful Valid Sultan, fought to safeguard her own influence at court. The empire's many religious minorities, mostly Christians and Jews, also faced a precarious existence. While the Ottoman millet system afforded them a degree of self-governance and religious freedom, it came at a price. Non-Muslims had to pay a special jizya tax and faced certain legal restrictions. There were periodic outbreaks of anti-minority violence and oppression. Over the centuries, many Christians and Jews converted to Islam to escape discrimination and open up opportunities for advancement. For those that held fast to their faiths, pressure from the Ottoman authorities was a fact of life. Catholic and Orthodox church hierarchies, for example, required approval from the Sultan, giving him leverage over Christian communities. The long-running rivalry between the Muslim Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe only added to the religious tensions within the empire. The Ottomans saw themselves as the rightful leaders of the Muslim world and the defenders of Islam against infidel invaders. Conquering Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christendom, was a crowning symbolic victory. Wars with the Holy League, the Habsburg monarchy, and Imperial Russia were painted as jihads to protect Muslim lands from Crusader aggression. Of course, despite their religious justification, these perennial conflicts only added to the hardships facing the Sultan's subjects, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. The cost in blood and treasure was immense. Nowhere was this more apparent than on the empire's frontiers. Border regions like the Balkans were racked by constant raids, massacres, and scorched earth tactics by both sides. Marauding bandits known as Hajduks and Uskoks terrorized villages. Captured towns might be plundered, their populations enslaved or forcibly converted. This climate of violence and instability only fueled simmering resentments among the Sultan's Christian subjects. In Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria, the Greek Orthodox and Slavs chafed under the Ottoman yoke and dreamed of independence. Their discontent would explode into open rebellion in the 1800s as the empire began its long decline. But in the 16th century, the Ottoman state was still at the apex of its wealth and power, with successive sultans presiding over an age of conquest and expansion. Selim the Grim pushed further into Persia and the Arabian Peninsula. His son Suleiman the Magnificent conquered Belgrade and Rhodes and laid siege to Vienna. Yet with each passing decade, the cracks in the Ottoman edifice grew deeper. Economic stagnation set in as the empire fell behind Europe in technology and commerce. Once lucrative trade routes were disrupted by new competitors like the Portuguese and Dutch. At the same time, the costs of maintaining a sprawling multi-ethnic empire were mounting. Supplying far-flung armies became a logistical nightmare. Unrest was brewing in the provinces. The rapid turnover of sultans, some ascending to the throne as mere children, left the empire with a string of incompetent rulers. By the 19th century, the Ottoman state was but a shadow of its former might, racked by debt, corruption, separatist revolts, and encroachment by foreign powers eager to carve off pieces of its territory. The government was forced to give humiliating concessions to European states. For the empire's beleaguered subjects, these were times of tremendous hardship and upheaval. Military defeats to Russia in the Crimean War and to breakaway Balkan states sapped morale and resources. The centuries-old millet system was breaking down. Massacres of Christian minorities, like the Bulgarians and Armenians, shocked the conscience of Europe. Efforts at modernization and reform, while ambitious, only seemed to accelerate the empire's disintegration as the forces of nationalism swept across Ottoman lands. Non-Turkish ethnic groups agitated for autonomy or outright independence. The outbreak of World War I and the Ottoman Empire's fateful decision to align with the Central Powers ultimately sealed its fate. After 4 long years of bloodshed, the war ended in total defeat for the Ottomans. The once mighty Sultanate was soon carved up by the victorious Allies. The Turkish-speaking rump was reconstituted as the Republic of Turkey in 1923, bringing an end to 600 years of Ottoman rule. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire continues to shape the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeastern Europe to this day. Its impact on the Islamic world is hard to overstate, with centuries as the seat of the Caliphate and the protector of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. But its is also a cautionary tale of the challenges and human toll of sustaining a diverse, far-flung empire across a tumultuous swath of the earth. For the millions of nameless subjects who eked out an existence in its villages and towns, life under the Ottoman Crescent was defined by hardship, oppression, and near-constant upheaval. Yet even in the face of tremendous adversity, the peoples of the Ottoman realms built vibrant cultures and lifeways that endured for centuries. Theirs is a story of resilience as much as subjugation, a reminder of the human capacity to carve out meaning in even the most trying of historical eras. And with that, our journey through the Ottoman world must come to an end for now. I hope this voyage into the past has proven as fascinating as it is restful. There are so many more stories to tell about this remarkable empire and its long, momentous history. Until next time, I wish you the most pleasant of dreams. This is Boring History for Sleep, signing off. Good night. The reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent from 1520 to 1566 is often considered the apex of the Ottoman Empire's power and glory. Suleiman presided over a vast realm that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf, from the Crimean Peninsula to the tip of the Arabian Peninsula. He was known as Kanuni, or the lawgiver, to his Ottoman subjects, but to the Western world, he became known as Suleiman the Magnificent, a fitting epithet for a ruler that commanded such immense power and wealth. Born in 1494, Suleiman was the only surviving son of Sultan Selim I. From a young age, the prince was groomed for leadership, studying sciences, literature, theology, and military tactics. Tall, broad-shouldered and handsome, with a long flowing beard, Suleiman cut an imposing figure. But he was renowned not only for his physical presence, but his sharp mind, poetic talent, and political acumen. When Suleiman ascended the throne in 1520 at the age of 26, the Ottoman Empire was already a force to be reckoned with, an expansionist dynamo that had conquered much of the Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans. But under Suleiman's leadership, it would reach even greater heights of power and prestige. One of his first acts as Sultan was to lead a military campaign against Belgrade, capturing the strategically vital city after a siege and bringing it under Ottoman control. This set the tone for much of Suleiman's 46-year reign, which was marked by relentless expansion through conquest. He would go on to conquer swaths of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Middle East, nearly doubling the size of the Ottoman realm. Suleiman was a hands-on military leader, personally commanding his armies in major campaigns. He was an expert tactician, strategically deploying his formidable Janissary infantry and elite Sipahi cavalry to devastating effect. In 1526, Suleiman delivered a crushing defeat to the Hungarians at the Battle of Mohacs, killing King Louis II and shattering the Hungarian monarchy. His armies surged through the Balkans, conquering fortress after fortress until they were practically at the gates of Vienna. The Ottomans' military success rested not only on skilled leadership, but on a massive, well-equipped standing army. perhaps the most formidable military machine in the world at that time. Hundreds of thousands of professional soldiers, both slave-conscripted Janissaries and Turkish free men, were at the Sultan's disposal. The Ottoman navy also reigned supreme in the Mediterranean, manned by skilled sailors and fierce corsairs. While a brilliant military mind, Suleiman was also renowned as a great statesman and lawgiver. He reformed and codified Ottoman law, earning him the title of Kanuni, the lawgiver. Suleiman sought to unify the disparate lands under Ottoman rule with a single legal framework based on Islamic Sharia law and Turkish customs. He laid down regulations governing everything from land tenure to criminal punishments to clothing and public morality. The Sultan's absolute authority was enforced through a strict hierarchy of military and religious officials. Suleiman ruled with an iron fist, quashing dissent and meting out brutal punishments to those who opposed him. He expanded the Ottoman secret police, known as the Mufti, and employed a vast network of spies and informants to root out treason and conspiracy. At the same time, Suleiman presided over a period of great artistic and architectural achievement. He was a major patron of the arts, commissioning grand mosques, palaces, and monuments across the empire. His chief architect, the brilliant Mimar Sinan, designed scores of magnificent buildings, from the Süleymaniye Mosque complex in Constantinople to the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne. The decorative Iznik tiles, intricately woven rugs, ornate metalwork, and other refined crafts of the Ottoman court were prized the world over. The Sultan himself was a gifted poet and goldsmith, creating exquisite jeweled objects and penning verse under the pseudonym Muhibi. He surrounded himself with an inner circle of cultured elites, artists, architects, musicians, scholars, and literati who flourished under his patronage. This glittering milieu centered around Topkapi Palace, Suleiman's sprawling royal residence overlooking the Bosphorus Strait. But even as the Sultan basked in splendor and his military campaigns enjoyed stunning success, there was a dark side to his reign. The Ottoman Empire was still an autocratic feudal state where the vast majority of the population lived in grinding poverty and had few rights. Slavery was rampant, with millions of people from conquered lands forced into servitude. The Devshirme system compelled Christian families in the Balkans to hand over young boys to be converted to Islam and serve in the Sultan's armies and administration. Religious minorities, particularly Christians and Jews, faced persecution and heavy taxation. They were tolerated as long as they accepted Ottoman supremacy and paid the jizya, a special tax levied on non-Muslims. But they had limited legal rights and social mobility, with many professions and positions of power closed off to them. Bloody pogroms and forced conversions were not uncommon. Even for Muslims, justice could be harsh and unyielding under the Ottoman system. Thieves and bandits faced summary execution or having their hands cut off. Adulterers, if caught, would be stoned to death. Apostates and heretics were burned at the stake. The empire employed a wide range of gruesome execution methods, from impalement to hanging to sawing in half. Daily life was a hardscrabble existence for most subjects of the empire, the majority of whom were peasants working the land in semi-feudal conditions. They were heavily taxed by the state, as well as their local feudal lords, with few rights or protections. Famine and plague were ever-present threats. The empire experienced periodic bouts of starvation and disease that decimated the populace. Cities like Constantinople and Cairo became massively overcrowded, teeming with poverty, crime, and squalor. Streets were narrow, buildings crammed together, with raw sewage and rotting garbage heaped in piles. Fire was a constant danger that could destroy entire neighborhoods of wooden houses in an instant. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were rampant. For women, life was particularly restricted, with little opportunity for education or work outside the home. They had few legal rights and were considered property of their husbands or male relatives. Rape and domestic violence were common and rarely punished. For slave women and concubines in the harems of the rich and powerful, life was even more precarious, subject to the whims and desires of their masters, with no real recourse. But nowhere were the harsh realities of Ottoman autocracy more apparent than for the slaves who formed the backbone of the Sultan's power. The empire was one of the largest slave-holding states in history, with millions of slaves at its height. Many were conscripted into the army as janissaries, or toiled as laborers, servants, and concubines. The janissaries, in particular, faced a grueling existence. These elite soldiers, recruited as young Christian boys, were subjected to intense military training and discipline, molded into a loyal fighting force utterly obedient to the Sultan. They were forbidden to marry or own property, living ascetic lives in military barracks. In battle, they displayed fanatical zeal, fighting to the death for their Sultan and the glory of Islam. But for all their privileges, the janissaries were still slaves, with no real autonomy, and as the Sultan's personal guard, they were also his potential rivals, feared for their ability to make or break a sultan. Over the centuries, the janissaries would become a powerful political force, rising up in mutinies and palace coups when they felt their interests were threatened. Suleiman, ever the canny politician, was adept at keeping the different factions of his empire in check and playing them off against each other. He was a master at manipulating the complex web of loyalties and rivalries in his court, harem, and government. But even he was not immune to the intrigues and power struggles simmering beneath the surface. One of the most momentous events of Suleiman's reign was sparked by harem politics and a bitter feud between his favorite concubine Hurrem and his childhood friend and Grand Vizier, Pargali Ibrahim Pasha. Hurrem, a slave girl of Russian origin, also known as Roxolana, became Suleiman's most beloved consort and eventually his legal wife, an unprecedented break with tradition. She bore him 6 children, including his heir Selim, and held immense influence over the Sultan. Hurrem saw Ibrahim Pasha as her chief rival for the Sultan's affections and grew increasingly jealous of his power and closeness to Suleiman. For years, she schemed against him, turning Suleiman against his old friend with whispered rumors and accusations. In 1536, Ibrahim Pasha was suddenly arrested and executed on Suleiman's orders, a shocking move that sent ripples throughout the empire. It was a stunning fall from grace for Ibrahim, who had risen from being a mere slave to become the Sultan's most trusted advisor and second in command. His death marked a turning point in Suleiman's reign, as the Sultan became increasingly suspicious, paranoid, and despotic in his later years. The Hurrem-Ibrahim affair also highlighted the cutthroat politics and power struggles that characterized the Ottoman court. The imperial harem, far from being merely a pleasure den, was a snake pit of ambitious concubines and wives vying for influence over the Sultan and promoting their own sons as heirs. Palace coups, assassination plots, and succession crises were a recurring feature of Ottoman history. Despite the challenges and upheavals, Suleiman's reign marked a high point for the Ottoman Empire in terms of power, wealth, and cultural achievement. The Sultan himself died in 1566 while on campaign in Hungary after 46 years on the throne. He left behind a formidable but increasingly unwieldy empire that had reached the limits of its expansion. In the centuries that followed, the Ottoman Empire would face growing challenges and a slow, steady decline. Weak and ineffectual sultans, economic stagnation, military setbacks, separatist movements, and the rise of European powers all took their toll. By the 19th century, the empire was the sick man of Europe, burdened by debt, corruption, and a failure to modernize. The Ottomans finally met their end in the upheaval of World War I, when they chose the losing side by aligning with the Central Powers. After the war, victorious Allied forces dissolved the empire and partitioned its territory, ending over 600 years of Ottoman rule. The Republic of Turkey emerged as a successor state, while former Ottoman lands became new nations or colonial possessions. But the legacy of the Ottoman Empire would endure long after its demise. Its impact can still be seen today in the culture, cuisine, architecture, and political borders of the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and North Africa. And in Turkey, the Ottomans remain a potent source of national identity and pride, with their history and achievements celebrated and mythologized. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire was one of the most powerful and influential states in the world, an Islamic superpower that shaped the course of history. But for the millions of ordinary people who lived under its rule, life was often a harsh, unforgiving struggle marked by poverty, disease, warfare, and persecution. The Ottoman centuries were a time of both grandeur and grit, achievement and atrocity that left an indelible mark on the world we know today. Life as an ordinary subject in the vast Ottoman Empire was often a daily struggle for survival. While sultans and the ruling class enjoyed opulent lifestyles in lavish palaces, the majority of the population endured hardships and challenges that made existence difficult and precarious. One of the greatest trials for Ottoman subjects was widespread poverty and destitution, particularly among the peasantry and lower classes in both urban and rural areas. Most commoners lived a meagre hand-to-mouth subsistence, toiling long hours as farmers, laborers, and servants, just to eke out enough to feed their families. In the empire's overcrowded cities, the impoverished masses huddled in squalid, cramped housing rife with filth and disease. Sanitation was poor, and access to clean water limited, allowing outbreaks of plague, cholera, and other infectious epidemics to regularly sweep through the poorer quarters, claiming untold lives. The close quarters and unsanitary conditions also bred crime, vice, and social ills. Medical care was rudimentary at best, with most people relying on folk remedies, prayers, and superstitions rather than doctors. Malnutrition and famine were also regular threats, as many regions of the empire suffered from drought, crop failures, and food shortages. A bad harvest could mean thousands starved, and whole villages were left abandoned. For the peasantry in the countryside, life revolved around difficult agricultural labor from dawn till dusk. Most were tenant farmers, working small plots of land owned by feudal-like Sipahi cavalry lords. Much of what they produced went to paying heavy taxes and tributes to their local Sipahi and the imperial government. Punishing levies on harvests left little for a farming family to sustain themselves. Peasants also faced the harshness of the local climate and terrain in different regions, from the baking deserts of Iraq and Arabia to the rugged mountains of Anatolia and the Balkans. Droughts, flash floods, storms, extreme temperatures and natural disasters could wipe out crops, livestock and villages. Lawlessness and banditry also plagued rural areas far from the centers of imperial authority. Whether in the city or country, the Sultan's subjects had few rights and little recourse against the whims of their rulers. The Ottoman Sultan wielded absolute power over the lives of those in his domain. He governed as a divinely ordained autocrat whose decrees could not be challenged. Any perceived disloyalty or disobedience was dealt with harshly. The Sultan maintained power and control over his sprawling empire with strict laws and brutal punishments. An extensive network of spies and informants kept watch for signs of sedition or rebellion. The slightest infraction could result in draconian sentences carried out by imperial soldiers and lawmen. Theft was punished by having the offender's hands cut off. Slander against the Sultan or government could get one's tongue cut out. Adulterers were stoned to death in public squares. Rebels, apostates, and traitors were hung, beheaded, or thrown off cliffs. More serious crimes could warrant fiendishly cruel deaths, like impalement on stakes. Imperial justice was arbitrary and unevenly applied. The complicated hierarchy of Ottoman courts and laws, Islamic Sharia, imperial Kanun decrees, and local Urfi customary rules allowed corruption to flourish. Innocent commoners often found themselves at the mercy of greedy cadis, judges, and ruthless jailers who extracted bribes for favourable rulings or simply to avoid languishing in squalid, nightmarish dungeons. The empire's many minority groups, Greeks, Armenians, Jews and others, faced added layers of discrimination, persecution, and oppressive taxation. As non-Muslims, they held second-class status with strict restrictions on their rights, religious practices, professions, and interactions with the Muslim majority. The threat of mob violence and blood libel always lurked should anti-minority sentiments be inflamed. Slave labour was extensive throughout the empire, and the sufferings of the enslaved were manifold. Slaves toiled in industrial workshops, served the imperial army, rowed galley ships, and did domestic work in the grand households. Slaves had no control over their fates and were wholly at the mercy of their masters. At the very bottom of society were serfs, essentially slaves tied to the land they worked rather than directly owned as property. In the Arab regions, they were the fellahin, landless peasants who worked the fields and estates. Their lives were a cycle of drudgery, poverty, and exploitation with no means of escape. Artisans and merchants comprised much of the small middle class in Ottoman society, but they too faced challenges and impositions. Craft guilds strictly controlled who could engage in certain trades and industries, limiting economic and social mobility. The government also levied burdensome taxes on commercial activities that stifled free enterprise. The dangerous trade routes that connected far-flung parts of the empire also impacted the common people, caught up in the flow of commerce. Nomadic tribes in the Levant faced displacement and conflict as the Silk Road trade network shifted. Piracy was a constant menace in the Mediterranean, and Barbary corsairs regularly raided coastal villages, capturing thousands of hapless residents to be sold as slaves in North Africa. Wars of conquest had devastating impacts on civilian populations caught in the crossfire between Ottoman armies and their foes. When Sultan Mehmed II's forces captured Constantinople in 1453, a three-day spree of looting, pillaging, and enslavement was unleashed on the city's residents. Tens of thousands were slain or taken as slaves. Fear of similar fates haunted those in the path of Ottoman military campaigns. The Sipahi feudal lords that governed most of the empire's territory were also a source of oppression and abuse for common Ottoman subjects. Many ruthlessly exploited the peasants who worked their lands with excessive levies and extortions. Corrupt and decadent Sipahis would seize property at will, force subjects into servitude, and violently put down any hint of resistance or uprising. With all these burdens and tribulations, it's little wonder the common people of the Ottoman Empire turned to their faith for solace and strength. Islam was a source of resilience and transcendence in the face of worldly sorrows. The call to prayer from minarets 5 times a day structured the rhythms of life and reminded the faithful that Allah's mercy was infinite even if the Sultan's justice was cruel. But religion was also one more mechanism of control and obedience wielded by the Ottoman state. As Caliph, the Sultan was the divinely appointed leader of the entire Islamic world. This spiritual authority combined with his temporal powers to make his rule absolute. Defying the Sultan was akin to defying the will of Allah. Imams, muftis, and religious scholars were a key part of imperial governance and social control. Islam provided the basis for laws, moral codes, and cultural norms. Religious orthodoxy was harshly enforced, and any deviation stamped out. Apostasy was punishable by death. There was little room for personal liberties or intellectual freedom when the stakes were seen as one's eternal soul. Non-Muslim subjects faced the added pressures of conforming to a social order where they were marked as inferior. Many Christians and Jews nominally converted to Islam simply to survive and avoid persecution. Pockets of minorities clung tenaciously to their faiths and identities, but at a steep price in systemic discrimination. This was the precarious existence that most Ottoman subjects had to endure century after century. Brief periods of reform and enlightened rulers offered glimmers of hope and easier times, but the empire's foundations remained the absolute authority of the Sultan, an entrenched feudal hierarchy and relentless extraction of resources from the populace. By the 19th century, the strains of maintaining this oppressive system and competing with the rising nation-states of Europe were tearing the Ottoman Empire apart. Separatist revolts flared in Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria as Christian subjects threw off the Sultan's yoke. The Ottomans racked up massive debts to European powers, lost control of outlying territories, and saw their military increasingly outmatched. But the empire staggered on until the upheavals of World War I finally led to its collapse and dissolution. The war years only compounded the misery and deprivations endured by Ottoman citizens as resources were drained for the military effort, and starvation became widespread. By the time the empire fell, its subjects were desperate for a new order. The long Ottoman centuries left a weighty and complex legacy for the many nations that emerged from the empire's carcass. Its influence is still felt in the Islamic world and Middle East today in everything from laws to architecture to cultural memory. For many in the region, pride in the Ottoman past mingles with painful reckonings of its injustices and dysfunctions. Understanding the realities of Ottoman society and the hardships most of its subjects faced for 600 years provides vital perspective. It was a civilization of remarkable triumphs and achievements, but built on a social order that inflicted incalculable sufferings and sorrows on millions to sustain the power and privilege of a tiny elite. Only by grappling with that fuller picture can we appreciate the resilience of those who endured life in the Ottoman Empire, and how that legacy continues to echo in our world today. The weight of that history is worth pondering, lest we forget the lessons of empires past in our own turbulent times. The Ottoman Empire was a realm of stark contrasts and extremes. Opulence and extravagance existed alongside poverty and hardship. At the pinnacle stood the Sultan, wielding absolute power over the fates of millions. The sultans of the Golden Age, like Suleiman the Magnificent and Selim the Grim, ruled with iron fists, expanding their domains through conquest and guile. In the early 16th century, Selim earned his epithet the Grim through his ruthless drive for power. Not content to rule a mighty empire, Selim had loftier ambitions: to rule the entire Islamic world as caliph. Upon taking the throne in 1512, he immediately set his sights on the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, the previous seat of the caliphate. Selim launched a lightning campaign, his elite janissaries and superior artillery crushing the Mamluk armies. In the span of just a year, Selim had conquered Egypt and Syria, claiming the mantle of caliph for himself and the Ottomans. Selim then turned eastward, determined to bring the Safavid Empire of Persia to heel. The Safavids were the champions of Shia Islam, rivals and apostates in the eyes of the Orthodox Sunni Ottomans. In 1514, Selim's army met the Safavids near Chaldiran in northwest Iran. Clad in silks and mounted atop his steed, Selim personally led the charge, smashing into the Safavid lines. It was a brutal melee of scimitars and spears, but Ottoman gunpowder and discipline won the day. The Safavid Shah Ismail barely escaped with his life. In the span of just 8 years, Selim had nearly doubled the size of the Ottoman Empire, earning the begrudging respect of friends and foes alike. The captured Safavid capital of Tabriz housed a grisly trophy from Selim's campaigns, a a tower built of the skulls of conquered enemies. Yet, for all his martial prowess, Selim lacked his son Suleiman's statesmanship and longevity. In 1520, Selim I died, leaving his son a sprawling empire to rule. Suleiman would prove more than up to the challenge, shepherding the empire to the zenith of its power and splendor. The mighty Suleiman, in the grandeur of the Topkapi Palace, lived in a world apart from the daily toil and struggles of his subjects. Exotic gardens, sumptuous banquets, and the sensual delights of the imperial harem stood in stark contrast to the austere lives of the common folk. While the Sultan dined on fine delicacies from gilded plates, many of his subjects subsided on a meager diet of grains, vegetables, and the occasional lamb on holidays if they were lucky. When famine struck, the peasantry faced a precarious existence, entirely dependent on the yield of their crops for survival. A prolonged drought or ill-timed frost could spell disaster, reducing once verdant fields to withered stalks. In desperate times, people resorted to eating grass and leaves to stave off starvation. Stricken villages became ghost towns, as families perished or fled in search of sustenance. The state granaries doled out rations, but never quite enough. Corrupt local officials often lined their pockets with a portion of the grain while the needy wasted away. Only slightly better off were the artisans and merchants of the bustling Ottoman cities like Bursa, Edirne, and Constantinople. The metalworkers, tanners, weavers, and spice traders generally enjoyed a humble sufficiency, plying their trades in the covered bazaars. Still, their lives were not without hardship. Strict guild regulations limited social mobility. An apprentice could toil for years before making master, let alone opening his own shop. Opportunities for education and advancement remained minimal for the lower classes. While the sons of elites studied at prestigious madrasas, the average Ottoman child was lucky to attain basic literacy from the local imam. An exceptionally bright student from an impoverished background might earn a scholarship to a religious school, but such stories were the exception, not the rule. For many, a life of backbreaking labor, conscription or serfdom was preordained from birth. No matter one's station, the looming presence of the Sultan and his sublime port reached into all corners of Ottoman life. The Kanun-i Osmani, the Sultan's law, dictated everything from criminal punishments to acceptable clothing for different religious communities. The slightest transgression or suspicion of disloyalty could bring down the wrath of the authorities. Specific gestures, greetings, and terms of address, when in the presence of officials, were compulsory. A breach of protocol or etiquette could lead to accusations of disrespect or even sedition. Particularly for non-Muslims, the ever-present risk of being denounced as an infidel or traitor to the state hung like a sword of Damocles over daily life. Christians and Jews were required to pay special taxes like the jizya, wear distinctive clothing, and endure various indignities and restrictions as dhimmis, protected but second-class subjects. The threat of violence or forced conversion at the hands of zealous Muslim mobs was an accepted reality in times of social upheaval or Janissary uprisings. Such was the plight of the Ottomans' newly conquered Christian subjects in the Balkans. As the Sublime Porte expanded into southeastern Europe, it encountered proud kingdoms like Serbia, Bulgaria, and Hungary. These once mighty realms, who had served as a bulwark of Christendom against Islam for centuries, now faced the full might of the Ottoman war machine. Lured by promises of holy war and plunder, Turkic Ghazis and their Balkan Martalos auxiliaries probed the frontiers, burning villages and enslaving captives. Sultan Murad Father himself fell in battle against the Serbs at Kosovo in 1389, becoming a martyr for the Ottoman cause. His son, Bayezid Fas, soon exacted a terrible vengeance, conquering Bulgaria and forcing the remaining Balkan princes into vassalage. For the conquered Christians, a new order now prevailed, one of exploitation, cultural pressure, and gradual Islamization over generations. Resentment and resistance seethed just beneath the surface. Haiduks and Uskoks, Balkan Christian rebels and brigands, waged a guerrilla war from mountain hideouts. Any young man with a grudge and a flintlock could join their ranks. Swift Ottoman reprisals in rebellious villages usually followed. It was said that some remote hamlets housed more widows than wives. Most infamous and feared was the child levy, the dev shirme. Every few years, Ottoman soldiers would descend upon terrified Balkan villages. All able-bodied Christian boys were assembled for inspection. The healthiest, smartest, and most handsome were wrested from their families to be impressed into the Sultan's service as janissaries, bureaucrats, or pages. It was considered a blood tax, one more onerous than any amount of gold. Tens of thousands of Balkan boys, raised in the Christian faith, were marched off to the Ottoman court. There they were circumcised, converted to Islam, and subjected to a grueling regimen of military training and indoctrination. Forbidden from marrying or growing beards, these slaves of the porter were molded into loyal soldiers and servants of the Sultan. Most janissaries were fated to a life of hardship and discipline on the empire's frontiers, while a select few rose to become generals or statesmen. Some served the Sultan so well that they earned the ultimate reward for a slave: freedom and a land grant to establish their own fiefdom. Ironically, the Ottomans came to prize these Balkan recruits as their most loyal troops, with fewer local ties and interests than freeborn Muslim Turks. For the families of these boys, it was a wrenching trauma, one repeated for generations. Outwardly, many had no choice but to profess their pride in having a son chosen to serve the Sultan. Inwardly, it was as if a limb had been severed from their family tree. Mothers were said to wear black for the rest of their days and light candles in remembrance of their lost sons. As the Ottoman Empire grew and sprawled across 3 continents, governing it became an ever more precarious balancing act. A bloated, corrupt, and faction-ridden bureaucracy strained to administer far-flung territories with hugely diverse populations. Ensuring loyalty and obedience in distant lands required both the velvet glove of patronage and the iron fist of force. The Timar system parceled out tracts of agricultural land to cavalrymen called sipahis in exchange for military service. While these feudal lords were nominally servants of the Sultan, they grew entrenched on their estates, extracting wealth from the peasantry. Corrupt tax farmers and provincial officials bought their posts at court, seeing their tenures as opportunities to line their pockets. The common folk grumbled, but what could they do? The Sultan is far and God is high, went the weary saying. Only the most egregious misrule that threatened stability or Sultan's revenue streams brought a response from Constantinople. Inspectors might be dispatched, a few particularly venal officials beheaded. But the system lumbered on, lurching from crisis to crisis. The carrot of imperial largesse and the stick of janissary swords maintained a tenuous equilibrium for the Sublime Porte. In the event of severe misrule or a local revolt, it was often the military that restored order, whether through strength of arms or the threat of force. The crack infantry of the janissaries, the disciplined cavalry of the sipahis, and the skilled crews of the Ottoman galleys formed the 3 pillars of Ottoman military might. All were slaves or servants of the Sultan, dependent on his goodwill for advancement and privilege in a highly stratified society. Such a massive standing army was both the Ottomans' greatest strength and a liability. Garrisoning far-flung frontiers from Hungary to Yemen drained the treasury. Lengthy campaigns against Persia or the Holy Roman Empire could leave the heartland dangerously exposed. And the janissaries or sipahis, when not occupied with foreign wars, posed a potential danger to the Sultan himself. More than one sultan fell victim to a palace coup or janissary revolt when the military felt its privileges were threatened. Selim III was infamously deposed, imprisoned, and murdered in 1808 after attempting military reforms unpopular with the Janissary Corps. The Ottoman military was as much a restive pressure group as a tool of the Sultan's will. Within the imperial frontiers, the population was divided into two broad classes: the askari or military class and the re'aya, the civilian tax-paying subjects. The askari consisted of janissaries, sipahis, judges, bureaucrats, and religious scholars, a kind of military administrative aristocracy. Fiercely proud of their status, these men wore elaborate, colourful uniforms with billowing silk pantaloons, towering turbans wrapped around conical hats, and curved scimitars at their waists. The askari were not just military men, but also cultured scholars, poets, and artists. Many were graduates of the palace school, where they received a classical education in literature, mathematics, theology, and courtly arts like calligraphy and music. Some Janissary garrisons patronized their own poets and storytellers to recite epics around the campfire. It was not unusual for a battle-hardened Janissary officer to pen a delicate love sonnet in the Persian style. In contrast to the askari, the re'aya were a vast, diverse mass: farmers, herders, artisans, merchants, labourers. Nominally, the Sultan's protected flock, the re'aya were in practice often subject to exploitation and arbitrary abuse by their masters. The askari saw them as a sea of interchangeable faces, valuable insofar as they filled the state coffers and granaries. The lot of the common folk was especially precarious along the empire's frontiers and borderlands. In wartime, a peasant family might see their crops burned, livestock slaughtered, and youths carried off by enemy raiders. In peacetime, the exactions of their own military lords could be nearly as devastating. Foraging armies of janissaries or sipahis could strip a village of food, fodder, and youths as they passed through. "Curses on the Sultan's war and the Sultan's peace," the peasants muttered. And yet, for all their hardship, the Ottoman common folk could still take some modest pride in being part of a magnificent Islamic empire, one of the greatest states the world had ever seen. The Ottoman Balkans were a lush, fertile land, yielding bountiful harvests of fruits, vegetables, and cereal crops. The empire's cities were architectural and commercial marvels: the spice bazaars of Constantinople, the silk markets of Bursa, the grand mosques of Edirne. Even the humblest re'aya could bask in some reflected glory on holy days, when the grandees and their glittering entourages would parade through the streets, showering the crowd with coin and sweets. For a moment, they could forget their toil and enjoy the spectacle of Ottoman pageantry in all its splendor. And so, the Ottoman Empire endured for centuries, a complex tapestry of peoples, faiths, and lifeways sprawling across Eurasia and North Africa. Generations of sultans, viziers, ghazis, and re'aya played their parts, lived and died, were woven into the rich and bloody fabric of Ottoman history. Ultimately, the Sublime Porte would face challenges that even Suleiman the Magnificent could not have foreseen: a rising Russian Empire, a surge of Balkan nationalism, the spread of revolutionary fervour, and a Europe rapidly outpacing the Ottomans in military and industrial might. But those are tales for another time, insha'Allah. For now, ponder the lives of those untold millions who called the Ottoman lands home over the centuries, from Sudan to the Danube, from Mecca to the Maghreb. Understand that their joys and sorrows, struggles and triumphs were not so different from our own. And remember that no matter how mighty the state, in the end, all are but humble servants before the judgment of Allah. Thus ends our journey through the Ottoman centuries. Salam alaikum. May peace be upon you, and may your dreams be sweet this night. The Ottoman Empire's centuries-long reign was marked by both grandeur and grit, progress and pain. For the Sultan and elites, life was often opulent and extravagant, but for the vast majority of Ottoman subjects, From Anatolia to Arabia to the Balkans, daily existence was a constant struggle filled with poverty, hardship, and precarity. The sprawling size of the empire itself created immense challenges. Governing such far-flung lands, from the Danube to the Nile to the Euphrates, was a monumental task in an age before modern communication and transportation. Messages from the imperial capital of Constantinople could take weeks or even months to reach distant provinces. Maintaining order and loyalty in the further reaches of the realm was a perennial difficulty. The empire encompassed staggeringly diverse geography and climates as well. Frigid winters in the Balkan mountains, searing heat in the Arabian deserts, harsh winds on the Anatolian steppe. Droughts and famines frequently ravaged different regions, adding to the suffering of the local populations. Travel through this vast domain was an arduous affair in the days of camel caravans and sailing ships. The flow of trade that was the lifeblood of the empire had to contend with bandits on the Silk Road, pirates on the Mediterranean, and the ever-present threats of weather and disease. For merchants and ordinary travelers alike, any long journey was a perilous undertaking. Ruling over this colossal empire was the Sultan, who wielded absolute power over his dominions. Sultanate authority was the ironclad fist that held the empire together. The Sultan's word was law, and his decrees could spell life or death for any of his subjects. Dissent or disobedience was dealt with harshly to maintain the strict order and control that the empire depended on. The reach of the Sultan's power could be felt in the humblest villages and the most distant frontier garrisons. Imperial firmans, or decrees, regulated everything from religious practices to trade tariffs to criminal punishments. The Sultan's armies of bureaucrats and tax collectors penetrated every corner of the empire, always ready to stamp out opposition and extract wealth to fill the imperial coffers. Upholding the Sultan's law were the empire's judges, the Cadis, who administered the Islamic legal system. Justice under the Ottomans was often harsh and unforgiving. Transgressions like theft and adultery could be punished by flogging, amputation, or even death by stoning. The wheels of Ottoman justice turned slowly, but when they did, the results were usually brutal. Non-Muslims, which made up a significant portion of the empire's population, faced particularly intense discrimination. Christians and Jews were tolerated and could practice their faiths, but as second-class citizens. They were subjected to special taxes, social restrictions, and a constant pressure to convert to Islam. At times of crisis or instability, religious minorities often bore the brunt of popular anger and persecution. The lowest rung on the social ladder in the Ottoman realm was occupied by slaves. The empire was one of the last to maintain large-scale slavery well into the 19th century. Whether toiling as laborers on farms and estates, serving as household servants to the wealthy, or filling the ranks of the Sultan's elite fighting force, the Janissaries, enslaved people endured some of the worst privations and exploitation. For ordinary Ottoman subjects, life was often nasty, brutish, and short. The vast majority eked out a meagre existence as peasant farmers or poor urban laborers. They contended with back-breaking toil, chronic poverty, disease, and deprivation. The lavish lifestyles of the Sultan and imperial elites were a world away from the hand-to-mouth hardships faced by most commoners. Daily life for the empire's poorest inhabitants meant living in overcrowded, squalid conditions in cities or in crude, rural dwellings. Hunger was a constant spectre. One bad harvest could spell destitution and even starvation for many. Access to education and opportunities for social advancement were extremely limited for the lower classes. Yet even for those not at the very bottom of the heap, life was still a precarious proposition. Merchants and artisans might enjoy a slightly higher standard of living, but they still had to navigate a thicket of imperial regulations, tolls, and taxes. The powerful trade guilds, strictly controlled who could enter certain professions. An unlucky reversal of fortune could easily plunge a family into poverty. And no matter one's station, the capricious cruelty of epidemic diseases was a great leveler. Plagues repeatedly scythed through Ottoman lands, laying waste to entire communities. The first eruption of the Black Death in the 14th century may have killed more than a third of the empire's population. Outbreaks of cholera, typhus, dysentery, and smallpox were tragically regular occurrences. Other blights like floods, droughts, fires, earthquakes, and locust swarms visited frequent destruction and misery, especially in densely populated cities like Constantinople and Cairo. Famine often followed on the heels of such disasters, compounding the suffering of already hard-pressed subjects. For all the challenges of daily survival, there was at least one burden that most Ottoman commoners didn't have to bear: serving in the Sultan's military. The empire's armies were disproportionately made up of slaves and subject peoples like the Balkans and Caucasus, who were pressed into service. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite slave soldiers, were a particularly remarkable example. High-ranking Ottoman officials would periodically descend on Christian villages, mostly in the Balkans, and take away young boys as part of a tribute system called devshirme. Torn from their families, these boys were converted to Islam, subjected to strict military discipline, and trained to become some of the fiercest warriors in the Sultan's armies. Whatever their origins, life for all Ottoman soldiers was full of privations and peril. Training was intense, and punishments for infractions severe. Campaigns to defend the empire's borders or expand its domains were a regular feature of military service. Brutal combat, debilitating injuries, and deadly diseases were omnipresent threats. When the Sultan's armies marched out to war, they cut a bloody swathe. The Ottoman Empire was almost constantly embroiled in military conflict on at least one of its sprawling frontiers. Clashes with the Russians and Austrians in the west, the Persians in the east, and uprisings from within the Sultan's domain itself kept the imperial war machine in a state of near perpetual activation. For those on the losing side of Ottoman conquests, the results could be catastrophic. When the Sultan's fearsome armies laid siege to the Hungarian city of Szigetvar in 1566, it was said that the defenders fought to the last man, with even the wounded taking up the sword. In the end, some 2,300 Hungarians were put to the sword, the city was burned, and thousands more were led away as slaves. Pitiless plunder and slaughter often accompanied Ottoman victories on the battlefield, as territories were pacified and their resources stripped to enrich the empire. The seizure of the majestic city of Constantinople in 1453 marked the start of the Ottomans' rise to a world power, but came at a terrible cost. The conquering army, led by Sultan Mehmed II, subjected the inhabitants to a nightmarish 3 days of murder, looting, rape, and enslavement. Ottoman justice could be just as merciless off the battlefield when the empire's rule was threatened. In 1522, when the Sultan's father Selim the Grim suspected the loyalty of 40,000 of his empire's subjects, he coldly ordered the mass execution of all of them. The slaughter took days, with the condemned being taken out in batches and systemically decapitated until the deed was done. Yet for all the methods of force and fear the Ottoman state had at its disposal, the spectre of instability and insurrection was never far away. Especially in the further reaches of the empire, provincial governors and landholders often accumulated their own local bases of power and could be only nominally loyal to the Sultan. Corruption and abuse of authority by imperial officials was an endemic problem. Particularly in times of weak sultans, the machinery of the Ottoman state could turn its predations on the very populace it was meant to protect and govern. Rapacious tax collectors, dishonest judges, and greedy governors could make the tough lot of common subjects even more miserable. The empire's formidable feudal cavalry, the The Timariates were granted their landholdings on the condition of military service. But by the 17th century, many Timariates were more interested in squeezing wealth out of their estates than reporting for duty. This decay and laxity in the Ottoman military system would eventually prove disastrous on the battlefield. Indeed, as the long 19th century unfolded, the once unbeatable Ottoman armies found themselves increasingly outmatched and outgunned by Western foes. Attempts by reformist sultans to modernize the sclerotic and corrupt state apparatus achieved only limited success. The Ottoman Empire entered a long, painful period of decline and retrenchment from which it would never recover. For Ottoman subjects, their empire's slow death spiral only compounded the hardships of daily life. Military defeats meant higher taxes, harsher conscription, and more economic disruption. Separatist revolts flared in the Balkans as decades of misrule and discontent finally boiled over. The government's coffers ran low, paying off European creditors, even as the Sultan and elites still enjoyed lives of luxury. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was known as the sick man of Europe. Its rulers clung to power more through the sufferance of European powers than their own might. The privations and precariousness that had stalked its subjects for centuries only intensified. When the empire made its final, fatal miscalculation by entering World War I on the side of the Central Powers, the end was near. 4 long years of devastating global conflict finally brought the Ottoman Empire, after a run of over 6 centuries, to its knees. The heartlands of Anatolia were ravaged by war and famine. Tens of thousands of the empire's Armenian subjects were massacred in a horrific genocide. In Arab lands, the British fomented revolt against Ottoman rule by making extravagant promises of independence. The final blow came at war's end, when the victorious Allied powers stripped away the last Ottoman territories and divided them into mandate states and spheres of influence. The once mighty empire was dead, leaving behind a shattered and impoverished populace. Out of its ashes, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk would forge the Republic of Turkey. But the legacy of Ottoman rule, for better and worse, endured throughout the Middle East. The lesson of the Ottoman centuries was a stark one, that an empire can bask in magnificence and luxury at its apex, while its masses toil in misery and squalor. The double-edged sword of Ottoman rule brought stability and strength on one side, but also stagnation and oppression on the other. So the next time you hear romanticized tales about the splendors of the Topkapi Palace, the opulence of the imperial harem, or the might of the Sultan's armies, remember the other side of the story. Remember the struggles and the suffering of the nameless millions who lived and died under the Ottoman crescent and star. Their fates may be obscured by time, but their experiences are no less real. And with that, our journey into the harsh underbelly of Ottoman history draws to a close. The once all-conquering empire that bestrode 3 continents is now itself consigned to the past, living on only in the pages of books and the curiosity of listeners like yourself. This has been a tour through some of its darkest and most difficult chapters, a reminder of the prices paid for imperial glory. Thank you for staying with me through this unvarnished look at life in the Ottoman domains. I hope it has given you a deeper and more nuanced sense of this fascinating but troubled chapter in human civilization. The Ottoman story is in many ways a cautionary one, but also an eternally captivating one, full of triumphs and tragedies, heroes and villains, and the heights and depths of the human experience. It's a story we'll never tire of telling or learning from. And so, with that, I bid you good night. May your dreams be filled not with the cares and woes of Ottoman subjects, but with the comfort and safety of your own familiar surroundings. Until next time, this is your humble history guide, signing off. As the 16th century dawned, The Ottoman Empire was a force to be reckoned with, straddling 3 continents and encompassing a vast array of peoples, religions, and cultures. It was a true superpower of its time. But for the millions living under the Sultan's rule, life was often a brutal and unforgiving struggle. Imagine for a moment the sheer scale of this empire at its zenith. From the bustling markets of Constantinople to the dusty caravan routes of Arabia, from the rugged peaks of the Balkans to the sun-baked shores of North Africa, the Ottoman dominion stretched as far as the eye could see. An intricate patchwork of territories and provinces, each with its own unique character, yet all bound together under the iron fist of the Sultan. Governing such a sprawling realm was no easy feat. Communication was slow and arduous in an age before modern technology. Messengers on horseback would gallop across the empire delivering decrees and dispatches, while news from distant corners could take months to reach the capital. Keeping a finger on the pulse of such a vast territory was a constant challenge for the Sultan and his ministers. The land itself could be harsh and unforgiving. Much of the empire lay in regions prone to droughts, famines, and natural disasters. In the arid wastes of Arabia, searing heat and lack of water made life a daily battle for survival. The rugged terrain of Anatolia and the Balkans, with its steep mountain passes and deep river gorges, posed its own obstacles to travel and commerce. When the rains failed or the snows came early, whole villages could find themselves teetering on the brink of starvation. But it wasn't just the land that made life difficult. The Sultan ruled his empire with an iron hand, demanding absolute obedience from his subjects. Dissent was rarely tolerated and swiftly crushed. The Ottoman legal system was notorious for its brutality, with harsh punishments meted out for even minor crimes. Thieves could expect to lose a hand, adulterers faced public stoning, and those who dared to question the authority of the Sultan or the teachings of Islam could find themselves on the executioner's block. For the average peasant or labourer, life was a constant struggle against poverty, disease, and exploitation. The vast majority eked out a meagre living as farmers, herders, or craftsmen, toiling from dawn to dusk just to keep food on the table. They lived in cramped, unsanitary dwellings, often little more than mud huts or ramshackle tenements, where disease ran rampant and infant mortality was appallingly high. The cities, for all their bustle and grandeur, could be just as unforgiving. The narrow, winding streets were often choked with filth and sewage, breeding grounds for all manner of pestilence. The poor huddled in overcrowded slums, packed cheek by jowl in a sea of humanity, while the wealthy retreated behind the high walls of their mansions and palaces. For the destitute and the outcast, life was a daily battle for survival on the margins of society. But even for those lucky enough to be born into privilege, life in the Ottoman Empire was far from easy. The ruling class was rife with intrigue and power struggles, as rival factions vied for influence over the Sultan and his court. In the secluded world of the imperial harem, the Sultan's wives and concubines schemed and plotted against one another, each hoping to bear the heir that would secure their place in the palace hierarchy. Perhaps no figure loomed larger in this world of shadows and secrets than the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning Sultan. She wielded immense power behind the scenes, using her influence to shape the course of the empire and eliminate any threats to her son's rule. The eunuchs who guarded the harem were also key players in this Game of Thrones, privy to the most intimate secrets of the royal family, and often acting as go-betweens in the constant power plays and intrigues. But even the mighty could fall in this cutthroat world. Sultans who failed to live up to the demands of their office could find themselves deposed or even murdered, while those who dared to challenge the established order could face the wrath of the Janissaries, the empire's elite infantry corps. These warrior slaves, recruited as boys from Christian families in the Balkans and raised to be fanatically loyal to the Sultan, were both the backbone of the Ottoman military and a constant threat to the stability of the state. As the centuries passed and the empire began to slowly decline, life for the average Ottoman subject only became harder. The once mighty army, the terror of Europe, found itself increasingly outpaced by the rising powers of the West with their superior technology and tactics. Corruption and decadence ate away at the foundations of the state, as officials lined their pockets and the sultans retreated into a world of opulence and excess. In the far-flung corners of the empire, separatist movements began to gain steam as long-oppressed peoples chafed under the yoke of Ottoman rule. In the Balkans, Serbian and Greek rebels took up arms against their Turkish overlords, while in the Arab lands, dreams of independence and self-determination began to stir. The once unassailable edifice of the Ottoman Empire was starting to crumble. For the millions of ordinary people caught up in this slow-motion collapse, life became an increasingly desperate struggle. Famines and economic crises swept the land, leaving whole regions destitute and starving. Disease ran rampant as the empire's overtaxed infrastructure buckled under the strain. In the cities, overcrowding and poverty fueled social unrest and crime, while in the countryside, bandits and highwaymen preyed on the weak and the helpless. Through it all, the spectre of war loomed large over the empire. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Ottoman armies found themselves increasingly hard-pressed to defend the empire's far-flung borders against the rising tide of nationalism and the predations of the great powers. In the Balkans, in North Africa, in the Caucasus and the Arab lands, the empire fought a desperate rearguard action, trying in vain to hold back the forces of change. But in the end, the Ottoman Empire's long slide into oblivion could not be stopped. The final blow came with the First World War, as the empire found itself on the losing side of the conflict. Carved up by the victorious allies and shorn of its outlying territories, the once mighty Sultanate was reduced to a rump state in Anatolia, a shadow of its former self. The fall of the Ottoman Empire marked the end of an era, the passing of a way of life that had endured for over 6 centuries. For the millions who had lived and died under its rule, it had been a harsh and often brutal existence, a world of constant struggle and hardship where life was cheap and the strong preyed on the weak. But it was also a world of great diversity and cultural richness, a melting pot of peoples and traditions that left an indelible mark on the lands it once ruled. From the soaring minarets of Istanbul to the bustling souks of Damascus, from the rugged hills of the Balkans to the shimmering sands of Arabia, the legacy of the Ottoman Empire endures to this day, a testament to the resilience and tenacity of the human spirit in the face of adversity. As we look back on this lost world, it's easy to be struck by the sheer scale of the suffering and hardship that so many endured under Ottoman rule. But it's also important to remember the moments of joy and beauty that punctuated those long centuries of toil and struggle. The laughter of children playing in the dusty streets of a Balkan village, the haunting strains of a Turkish lute drifting through the night air, the simple pleasures of a cup of coffee shared with friends in a Cairo cafe. These were the small mercies that made life bearable for the millions who called the Ottoman Empire home. The glimmers of light in a world that could often seem so dark and unforgiving. And as we remember their struggles and their triumphs, we are reminded of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the greatest of odds. So let us pause for a moment to honor the memory of those who came before us, those who toiled and suffered under the yoke of the Ottoman sultans. Let us remember their stories and their sacrifices, and let us draw strength from their example as we face the challenges of our own time. For in the end, the history of the Ottoman Empire is not just a story of brutality and oppression, but also one of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of our common humanity.
Life in the far-flung provinces and frontier regions of the Ottoman Empire was often precarious and demanding, especially for those serving in the military garrisons that guarded the empire's vast borders. These soldiers, known as Serhadkulu or frontier guards, manned a network of fortresses and outposts stretching from the Balkan Mountains to the Arabian Desert and from the Caucasus to North Africa. For these men, life was a constant cycle of training, patrolling, and fighting. They had to be ready at a moment's notice to repel raids by enemy forces or rebellious tribes, and to launch their own expeditions into neighboring lands to expand the empire's territory. The conditions in these frontier garrisons were often harsh and Spartan, with soldiers living in cramped barracks or tents, subsisting on simple rations of bread, rice, and stew. But beyond the physical hardships, the frontier guards also faced the psychological toll of being constantly on alert, never knowing when the next attack might come. They were far from their homes and families, often serving for years at a time in hostile and unfamiliar lands. Many of them were recruited or conscripted from the empire's Christian subjects in the Balkans, adding to their sense of isolation and alienation. One of the most famous frontier garrisons was the city of Buda in Hungary, which the Ottomans captured in 1541 and turned into a major stronghold on their European frontier. For over 150 years, Buda was a key bastion against Habsburg Austria and other Christian powers, its walls bristling with cannons and its streets patrolled by elite Janissary units. Life in Buda was a microcosm of the Ottoman frontier experience, a mix of boredom, tension, and sudden violence. The city's Ottoman inhabitants, a mix of soldiers, officials, and merchants, lived in a fortified enclave within the larger town, complete with mosques, baths, and bazaars. They were constantly on guard against potential attacks or uprisings by the city's Hungarian population, who chafed under Ottoman rule and dreamed of liberation. One of the most colourful and controversial figures to govern Buda was Sokollu Mustafa Pasha, who served as the city's bey or governor in the 1660s. A Bosnian Muslim from a Serb family, Mustafa Pasha was a clever and ambitious man who rose through the ranks of the Ottoman hierarchy through a combination of military prowess, political savvy, and sheer ruthlessness. As governor of Buda, Mustafa Pasha was known for his harsh methods of keeping order and extracting revenue from the city's inhabitants. He imposed heavy taxes on the Hungarian merchants and artisans, and used the funds to build grandiose mosques and palaces for himself and his retinue. He also had a habit of seizing attractive Hungarian women and boys for his own pleasure, a practice that earned him the hatred and fear of the local population. But Mustafa Pasha was also a canny diplomat and strategist who managed to keep the peace in Buda and fend off attempts by the Habsburgs to retake the city. He forged alliances with local Hungarian nobles and played them off against each other, while also maintaining good relations with the Sublime Porte back in Istanbul. His skill and ruthlessness as a frontier governor earned him the nickname Sokollu, or Falcon in Turkish. Mustafa Pasha's luck finally ran out in 1566 when he was killed during a failed Ottoman siege of the nearby fortress of Sigetvar. His death was seen as a major blow to Ottoman prestige and power in Hungary and marked the beginning of a long, slow decline in their control over the region. The story of Sokollu Mustafa Pasha and the fortress of Buda highlights the complex and often brutal nature of life on the Ottoman frontier. For the soldiers and governors tasked with defending and expanding the empire's borders, it was a world of constant struggle and danger where one's fortunes could rise or fall in an instant. Their lives were marked by a potent mix of ambition, greed, violence, and political intrigue, all played out against a backdrop of clashing cultures and faiths. But while figures like Mustafa Pasha may have wielded great power and influence in their own domains, they were ultimately just cogs in the vast machine of the Ottoman state. subject to the whims and orders of the Sultan and his court back in Istanbul. The real power in the Ottoman Empire lay not on the frontiers, but in the opulent palaces and gardens of the imperial capital, where a different kind of struggle for dominance was taking place. This was the world of the Ottoman harem, a secretive and labyrinthine realm where the Sultan's wives, concubines, and female relatives vied for power and influence over the empire's affairs. At the center of this world was the Valide Sultan, or Queen Mother, the woman who had given birth to the reigning Sultan and who wielded immense authority and respect within the harem. The Valide Sultan's power derived from her unique position as the Sultan's mother and chief advisor. She had unparalleled access to the Sultan's ear and could influence his decisions on matters of state, from the appointment of grand viziers to the launching of military campaigns. She also controlled the harem's vast financial resources and used them to build her own network of clients and allies among the empire's elites. One of the most famous and formidable Valide sultans was Nurbanu Sultan, who ruled the harem during the reign of her son, Murad III, in the late 16th century. A Venetian woman who had been captured by Ottoman pirates and sold into the harem as a concubine, Nurbanu rose to become Murad's favorite consort and eventually his legal wife. As Valide Sultan, Nurbanu wielded immense power and influence over the empire's affairs. She was a skilled politician and diplomat who forged alliances with key officials and factions within the Ottoman court. She also patronized artists, poets, and scholars, and used her wealth to build mosques, schools, and other public works across the empire. But Nurbanu's power also had a darker side. She was known for her ruthless treatment of rivals and enemies within the harem, and was rumored to have had a hand in the deaths of several of Murad's other consorts and children. She also faced challenges from other powerful women within the harem, such as Safiya Sultan, the mother of Murad's successor, Mehmed III. The rivalry between Nurbanu and Safiya would come to a head after Murad's death in 1595, when Mehmed took the throne and Safiya became the new Valide Sultan. Nurbanu, now demoted to the rank of grandmother, found herself sidelined and isolated within the harem, her power and influence waning with each passing day. In the end, Nurbanu's fate was a reminder of the precarious and often brutal nature of life within the Ottoman harem. For all their wealth, status, and influence, the women of the harem were ultimately dependent on the whims and desires of the Sultan and his court. They could rise to great heights one day, only to be cast down and forgotten the next. The story of Nurbanu Sultan and the Ottoman harem is a fascinating and complex one, full of intrigue, ambition, and power struggles that rivaled anything happening on the empire's frontiers. It is a reminder that even in the most opulent and privileged corners of Ottoman society, life could be harsh, unforgiving, and subject to sudden reversals of fortune. The Ottoman Empire was one of the most powerful and influential empires in history, spanning over 600 years and 3 continents at its height. But life within this vast realm was often harsh, precarious, and unforgiving for many of its subjects. As we delve deeper into the realities of Ottoman society, it's important to understand the complex web of political, religious, and social factors that shaped daily life. The Sultan, as both the political and spiritual leader of the empire, wielded immense power and control over his subjects. His word was law, and any dissent or disobedience was met with swift and often brutal punishment. But the Sultan's reach extended far beyond the political sphere. As the Caliph, or leader of the Islamic world, he was responsible for defending Muslim lands and holy cities, and for enforcing religious orthodoxy throughout the empire. This often meant stamping out heretical sects and imposing strict Islamic law on all subjects, regardless of their personal beliefs. For non-Muslims living under Ottoman rule, life was particularly challenging. Christians and Jews faced persecution, discrimination, and heavy taxation simply for practicing their faiths. In some cases, Christian boys were even taken from their families and forced to serve the Sultan as part of the devshirme system, which supplied the empire with soldiers and bureaucrats. But perhaps no group faced greater hardship than the slaves who toiled in every corner of the empire. Whether they were laboring in the fields, serving in wealthy households, or fighting on the front lines of the Sultan's wars, slaves had few rights and little hope of escape. As we continue our journey through the Ottoman Empire, we'll meet some of the key figures who shaped its history and explore the ways in which their actions impacted the lives of ordinary people. From the Grand Viziers who wielded power in the Sultan's name, to the rebels and reformers who fought against the empire's injustices, these individuals left an indelible mark on the world they inhabited. One such figure was Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power in the 16th century. Born in 1494, Suleiman was the son of Sultan Selim and was groomed from a young age to take the throne. He was known for his military prowess, his patronage of the arts and sciences, and his ambitious building projects, which included the stunning Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul. But Suleiman was also a complex and sometimes contradictory figure. He was a devout Muslim who saw himself as the defender of the faith, but he was also a pragmatic ruler who recognized the need for religious tolerance in his vast and diverse empire. He was a brilliant military strategist who expanded the empire's borders through conquest and diplomacy. But he was also a ruthless leader who brooked no dissent and dealt harshly with his enemies. Under Suleiman's rule, the Ottoman Empire reached its greatest extent, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf. But this vast expansion came at a cost, both in terms of human lives and economic resources. Suleiman's wars of conquest were expensive and bloody, and they often left the empire's coffers depleted and its people impoverished. But even in times of relative peace, life in the Ottoman Empire was far from easy. For the vast majority of its subjects, daily life was a constant struggle against poverty, disease, and oppression. In the empire's crowded cities, poor sanitation and inadequate medical care meant that outbreaks of plague and other diseases were all too common. In the countryside, droughts and famines could wipe out entire communities, leaving families destitute and starving. And yet, despite these hardships, the Ottoman Empire endured for centuries, thanks in part to the resilience and adaptability of its people. From the merchants who plied the empire's trade routes, to the artisans who crafted its beautiful textiles and ceramics, Ottoman subjects found ways to survive and even thrive in the face of adversity. As we explore the lives of these individuals, we'll gain a deeper appreciation for the complexities of Ottoman society and the ways in which it shaped the modern world. We'll see how the empire's legacy continues to influence the politics, culture, and religion of the Middle East and beyond, and how its stories of triumph and tragedy still resonate with us today. One of the most fascinating and little-known aspects of Ottoman society was the role of the imperial harem. Far from being a simple pleasure palace for the Sultan, the harem was a complex and hierarchical world unto itself, with its own rules, customs, and power struggles. At the top of the harem hierarchy was the Valide Sultan, or Queen Mother, who wielded enormous influence over her son, the reigning Sultan. The Valide Sultan was responsible for overseeing the harem's daily affairs, from managing its finances to arranging marriages and alliances among its members. Below the Valide Sultan were the Sultan's wives and concubines, who competed fiercely for his attention and favor. Many of these women were slaves who had been captured in war or purchased from slave markets, and their lives were often marked by isolation, intrigue, and danger. But the harem was also home to a variety of other women, including the Sultan's daughters, sisters, and other female relatives. These women often played important roles in Ottoman politics and diplomacy, using their connections and influence to advance their own interests and those of their families. One of the most famous women of the Ottoman harem was Roxolana, a Ukrainian slave who rose to become the chief consort of Suleiman the Magnificent. Roxolana was known for her beauty, intelligence, and political savvy, and she used her position to wield significant power behind the scenes of the Ottoman court. But Roxolana's rise to power was not without controversy or danger. She was rumored to have plotted against her rivals in the harem, including Suleiman's other wives and even his own son Mustafa. In 1553, Mustafa was executed on Suleiman's orders, allegedly at Roxolana's instigation, in a move that shocked the empire and solidified her influence over the Sultan. Roxolana's story is just one example of the complex power dynamics that played out within the walls of the Ottoman harem. While some women were able to use their positions to achieve great influence and authority, others were relegated to lives of servitude and exploitation, with little hope of escape or advancement. As we continue to explore the rich and often brutal history of the Ottoman Empire, it's important to remember the countless individuals whose lives were shaped by its power structures and social hierarchies. From the lowliest slave to the most powerful sultan, every person in the empire played a role in shaping its destiny, for better or for worse. As the Ottoman Empire's power and influence spread across the Mediterranean, North Africa and the Middle East in the 16th century, the Sultan's navy played an increasingly vital role in projecting Ottoman might, securing trade routes, and defending the empire's far-flung coastal territories. Life at sea for Ottoman sailors was full of hardships and dangers. The imperial fleet, while one of the most formidable maritime forces of its day, was still at the mercy of the unpredictable Mediterranean weather. Warships were often caught in devastating storms, with entire crews lost to the wind and waves. Disease was another constant threat in the cramped, damp, and unsanitary conditions on board ships. Epidemics could rage through a vessel, decimating its crew. When not battling the elements, Ottoman sailors faced the ever-present risks of naval warfare. Conflicts with the navies of Christian European powers like Spain, Venice, and the Knights of Malta were frequent as the Ottoman Empire sought to dominate the Mediterranean. Ferocious cannon battles and bloody deck-to-deck fighting saw heavy casualties on all sides. For those unfortunate enough to be captured by the enemy, a grim fate awaited. Slavery, torture, or summary execution were commonplace. The life of the galley slave, chained to an oar and mercilessly driven by the crack of the overseer's whip, was especially brutal. Even in times of relative peace, an Ottoman sailor's lot was not an easy one. Piracy was rampant on the high seas, and Ottoman shipping was often the target of daring raids by the Barbary corsairs of North Africa and other brigands. These swift and nimble pirate ships would swoop in on merchant vessels, overwhelming them with cannon fire and boarding parties. The pirates seized cargo, ships and crews to be ransomed or sold into slavery. For those sailors manning the coasts and ports of the empire, life was somewhat more stable, but no less challenging. The Ottoman navy was responsible for defending the empire's long Mediterranean and Red Sea coastlines, as well as strategic choke points like the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits. This required a network of coastal fortifications, naval bases, and frontier garrisons that were often situated in remote and inhospitable locales. Crews of naval personnel would be stationed at these outposts for long stretches, far from the comforts of home and hearth. They endured isolation, boredom, and Spartan living conditions in service to the Sultan. Malaria and other diseases endemic to marshy coastal areas took a heavy toll. So too did the occasional raids and skirmishes with enemy forces and local rebellious populations that they were tasked with keeping in line. In addition to naval battles and coastal defense, the Ottoman fleet was key to maintaining the empire's commercial lifelines. Merchant ships laden with valuable goods like silks, spices, coffee, and ceramics plied the maritime trade routes between Ottoman ports in the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, and the Levant. Naval ships escorted these convoys to ward off piracy and protect the flow of trade. However, even this could be hazardous duty, as heavily armed Venetian and Genoese merchant galleys jealously guarded their own trading interests and often clashed with their Ottoman counterparts. The life of an Ottoman sailor was thus one of constant vigilance and peril, even in the best of times. Despite the immense hardships they faced, Ottoman sailors were a tough and resilient lot, hailing from across the empire's diverse domains. Many were recruited or conscripted from the coastal regions of the Balkans, Anatolia, the Levant, and North Africa. Others were slaves or prisoners of war, fated to spend their remaining years as galley oarsmen. While some served out of loyalty to the Sultan and the promise of regular pay, others had little choice in the matter. Many were pushed into naval service by economic hardship or as a punishment for crimes. Orphans and debtors were often sent to the galleys, and in times of manpower shortages, the empire resorted to press gangs to round up able-bodied recruits from port towns and coastal villages. Rigid discipline, stern punishments, and the ever-present threat of death kept these motley crews in line and functioning as an effective naval force. Life in the Ottoman Navy offered little prospect of social advancement or a comfortable retirement. Most sailors and oarsmen were illiterate and hailed from the lower rungs of society. While a talented few might rise to the rank of captain or admiral, the majority spent their days toiling away on deck or chained to an oar, with little to look forward to beyond an anonymous death at sea or an impoverished old age, if they were lucky enough to survive their term of service. The top naval commanders and admirals, usually handpicked by the Sultan for their skill and loyalty, fared somewhat better. They were well compensated and wielded considerable authority, controlling promotion and patronage within the fleet. The most successful could amass substantial personal wealth from prize money and the sale of captured goods and slaves. However, even these elite officers were not immune to the dangers of their profession or the fickle whims of their imperial master. The price of failure was high, and many an admiral found himself stripped of rank and fortune, exiled or executed after a disappointing campaign or losing a major engagement to Christian forces. The turnover rate for Ottoman naval commanders was notoriously high as a result. One of the most famous and formidable Ottoman admirals was Hayreddin Barbarossa, a legendary Barbary corsair who rose to become Admiral-in-Chief of the Ottoman Navy under Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century. Born on the Greek island of Lesbos to a Turkish father and Greek Christian mother, Barbarossa and his brothers took up piracy as young men, quickly earning a fearsome reputation for their skill and daring. In 1516, Barbarossa seized Algiers and placed his pirate kingdom under Ottoman suzerainty, providing him with money, men and ships to continue his raids against Christian shipping. His exploits brought him fame and fortune, and soon caught the attention of Sultan Suleiman. Impressed by Barbarossa's audacity and success, Suleiman appointed him Admiral-in-Chief of the Ottoman Navy in 1533. Under Barbarossa's leadership, the Ottoman fleet became the dominant maritime power in the Mediterranean. He led numerous campaigns against the Spanish and Portuguese, capturing Tunis and expanding Ottoman control along the North African coast. His ships raided the coasts of Italy, Spain, and the islands of the Western Mediterranean, bringing back immense plunder and thousands of captives to be sold as slaves. Barbarossa's most famous victory came at the Battle of Preveza in 1538, where he decisively defeated a larger allied Christian fleet commanded by the famed Genoese admiral, Andrea Doria. The battle solidified Ottoman naval supremacy and sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Barbarossa's skill and charisma made him a hero among his men and a dreaded foe to the Christian powers. Despite his fierce reputation, Barbarossa was known for his chivalry and fair treatment of prisoners. He famously spared the life of a Spanish knight who had insulted him after being captured, saying, "I have no use for insults, but I have use for brave men." He was also an able administrator, using his wealth and influence to build mosques, schools, and public baths in Algiers and Istanbul. Barbarossa's legacy loomed large long after his death in 1546. His exploits became the stuff of legend, celebrated in Turkish and Arabic folk songs and poetry. He became a symbol of Ottoman naval might and Muslim resistance to Christian European encroachment. Even today, the Turkish Navy has a ship named after him, and he is still remembered as one of the greatest admirals in Turkish history. The Ottoman Navy reached its zenith under Suleiman the Magnificent in the mid-16th century, dominating the eastern Mediterranean and challenging the naval powers of Western Europe. However, this glory was relatively short-lived. The devastating defeat at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 to the ships of the Holy League marked the beginning of a long, slow decline in Ottoman naval power. The reasons for this decline were many. The empire's best sailors and shipwrights were gradually lost through attrition, with few replacements of equal quality. Corruption and nepotism saw less able officers promoted to positions of command. The Ottoman shipyards, once the envy of the Mediterranean, became increasingly inefficient and struggled to keep pace with the latest advances in European shipbuilding and naval artillery. At the same time, the rise of Atlantic-based naval powers like England and the Netherlands saw maritime trade shift away from the Mediterranean, diminishing the importance of the Ottoman Navy. The loss of key North African ports to Spain and the growing independence of the Barbary states also weakened the Ottoman fleet's ability to control the seas. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Navy was a shadow of its former self, outclassed and outgunned by its European rivals. It suffered a series of humiliating defeats, culminating in the disastrous Battle of Chesma in 1770 against the Russians, which saw much of the Ottoman fleet destroyed at anchor. Despite efforts at modernization and reform in the 19th century, the Ottoman Navy never fully recovered its former glory. For the average Ottoman sailor, these changes mattered little. Life on the seas remained as hard and perilous as ever, even as the empire's fortunes waned. Sailors continued to risk death, disease, and capture as they manned the Sultan's ships, often with little hope of reward or advancement. Even in decline, an Ottoman sailor's life was a brutal and thankless one, with danger and hardship as constant companions. As the Ottoman Empire entered the turbulent early decades of the 20th century, its navy played an increasingly minor role. The fleet was involved in the Italo-Turkish War of 1911-12, where it suffered losses to the Italians, and in the Balkan Wars of 1912-13, but these were peripheral to the main fighting on land. The Ottoman Navy's final chapter came during World War I, when the empire sided with the Central Powers against the Allies. In a bid to knock the Ottomans out of the war, Britain and France launched the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, seeking to force the Dardanelles and capture Constantinople. Ottoman mines and coastal artillery took a heavy toll on Allied warships, contributing to the failure of the naval assault on the Straits. However, the Ottoman fleet itself saw little action during the war, spending most of its time bottled up in port due to fuel shortages and the overwhelming superiority of Allied naval power in the Mediterranean. The most significant Ottoman naval action was the sortie of the German battlecruiser Goeben and a light cruiser Breslau to Constantinople in 1914, where they were transferred to the Ottoman Navy and played a role in bringing the empire into the war on the side of Germany. With the Ottoman Empire's defeat and dissolution after World War I, its once mighty navy ceased to exist. The ships that remained were divided up among the victorious allies or scrapped. It was an ignominious end to a naval tradition that had once been the terror of the Mediterranean. For over 300 years, the Ottoman Navy had been a key pillar of the empire's power and prosperity, essential to its expansion and defense. Throughout this time, Untold thousands of Ottoman sailors had lived and died on the empire's ships, enduring hardships and dangers that most of us can scarcely imagine. From the oarsmen chained to the galleys to the admirals commanding mighty fleets, all were caught up in the brutal struggle for supremacy on the waves. Their lives were ones of constant peril and privation, their fates tied to the fortunes of a vast and often volatile empire. In the end, the story of the Ottoman Navy is one of both great triumphs and slow decline, mirroring the trajectory of the empire it served. It is a reminder of the human cost of imperial ambition and the toll it takes on those who are caught up in its currents. The legacy of the Ottoman sailor, toiling on the seas for sultan and empire, echoes down through the centuries, a testament to the enduring resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. The Ottoman Empire was a realm of contrasts: ornate palaces and squalid hovels, magnificent wealth and destitute poverty, strict piety and brutal torture. For the select few at the top, life was opulent and extravagant beyond imagination. But for the vast majority of the empire's subjects, daily existence was a harsh struggle rife with challenges, restrictions, and injustices. While the sultans indulged their every whim in lavish palaces like Topkapi and Dolmabahce, most of their subjects eked out a meager living in grinding poverty. The lucky ones might dwell in cramped tenements in the narrow, winding alleys of Constantinople or Smyrna. The poorest of the poor huddled in makeshift shanty towns or scratched a living from the unforgiving soil as peasants. Life was a constant battle against hunger, disease, and the whims of corrupt officials. The cities heaved with overcrowding and squalor. Sanitation was primitive at best, with raw sewage and rotting refuse choking the streets. Potable water was scarce, and cholera, dysentery and typhoid ran rampant in the fetid conditions. Swarms of biting flies and stinging mosquitoes tormented the inhabitants and spread waves of malaria and plague. Most citizens couldn't afford the services of doctors or apothecaries, relying instead on prayer and superstition in the face of rampant illness and suffering. In the countryside, peasants faced the age-old scourges of famine and drought. Starvation was an ever-present spectre. A few seasons of scanty rainfall could leave entire villages destitute and desperate, scrabbling for any morsel to fill their bellies. Locusts, rats, and other vermin ravaged fields and granaries, while marauding bandits carried off what little the farmers managed to hoard away. When crops failed, many had no choice but to abandon their lands and join the swelling ranks of beggars in the towns. For those lucky enough to find work, toil was back-breaking and wages pitiful. Craftsmen laboured from dawn to dusk in sweltering workshops and noxious tanneries. Weavers hunched bleary-eyed over their looms until their fingers bled, while blacksmiths sweltered over smoking forges. Millers choked on billowing flour, and sawyers hacked at timber until their hands were riddled with blisters. Merchants and moneylenders fared better, but lived in constant fear of robbers, rioting mobs, or avaricious tax collectors. Trade was the lifeblood of the Ottoman economy, but fraught with dangers and hardships. Caravans braved bandits, floods, sandstorms, and scorching heat to transport silks and spices along the ancient Silk Road. Sea captains risked storms, pirates, and scurvy to carry cotton and carpets across the Mediterranean. Yet oppressive tariffs, extortionate officials, and shifty middlemen conspired to bleed away their hard-earned profits. And always there was the Sultan, skimming off his share through customs duties, port fees, and taxes on every transaction. Craftsmen and merchants banded together in guilds to assert their rights and defend their livelihoods against exploitation. But the guilds were a mixed blessing, enforcing strict controls over production, prices, and competition. Woe betide any artisan who dared to work longer hours or undercut his fellows. He would face crippling fines or a beating from guild enforcers, and certain trades were restricted to Muslims alone, limiting opportunities for Jewish and Christian subjects. Non-Muslims faced even greater hardships and restrictions under Ottoman rule. As conquered peoples, they were relegated to second-class status, tolerated, but never equal. Most were confined to ghettos, subject to curfews, and barred from riding horses or bearing arms. They paid special taxes, like the jizya, a yearly poll tax on every adult male, and faced pressure to convert to Islam to escape such burdens and indignities. Their religious practices were tightly restricted. Church bells were silenced, synagogues couldn't be repaired without permission, and public processions were banned. For Christian families in the Balkans, there was the added trauma of the devshirme, the periodic levees in which the Ottomans abducted young Christian boys to serve as slave soldiers in the Sultan's Janissary Corps. Terrified parents tried to hide or marry off their sons to avoid this fate worse than death. Taken far from their homes, the boys were circumcised and force-fed the teachings of Islam, beaten into fanatical loyalty to the Sultan. Only the toughest and most ruthless survived to join the Janissary ranks. Life was perhaps harshest of all for slaves, and the Ottoman Empire was one of the world's biggest slave states. In Constantinople alone, there were tens of thousands of slaves from Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Caucasus. Galley slaves hauled on the oars of warships as overseers flayed their backs raw. Laboring slaves, their faces branded, hacked at stone in quarries and mines. Domestic slaves toiled in the households of the rich, where disobedience could mean a whipping or worse. Female slaves in particular faced sexual exploitation, with many bound for the empire's brothels or the harems of the elite. Circassian and Georgian concubines were highly prized for their fair skin and beauty, with the most desirable presented as gifts to the Sultan himself. Those that caught his eye joined the ranks of his harem, numbering into the hundreds, where they schemed and seduced in a ruthless contest to bear him a son and become the next Valid Sultan, mother of the heir and power behind the throne. Over the centuries, a few remarkable women clawed their way to the top of this cutthroat world. Through cunning, treachery, and sheer force of will, they ruled the empire in all but name. There was Hürrem Sultan, a slave girl who bewitched Suleiman the Magnificent and eliminated her rivals to become his queen. Kösem Sultan dominated the empire for decades through her sons and grandsons. Turhan Hatice dispatched plotters and grand viziers to secure the throne for her young son, Mehmed IV. But even these iron-willed Valide sultans were only a heartbeat away from losing power and their lives to the next ambitious schemer. As the Ottoman Empire began its long, slow decline in the 18th and 19th centuries, life only grew harsher for its citizens. Reforming sultans like Selim III and Mahmud II tried to stem the rot with modernization programs and new laws, but change was piecemeal and fiercely resisted by reactionary factions. Military defeats sapped the empire's strength and drained its treasuries. Separatist movements flared in the Balkans as Christian subjects dreamed of casting off the Turkish yoke. Outwardly, Constantinople still dazzled, a cosmopolitan metropolis of 1 million souls, straddling Europe and Asia, thronged with merchants and muezzins, dervishes and dragomans. Tall ships still thronged the Golden Horn. The Great Bazaar still hummed, and the skyline still bristled with domes and minarets. But within, the Ottoman state was rotting, hollowed out by corruption and decay. The Janissaries, once the scourge of Christendom, had degenerated into a bloated, rebellious rabble. Sultans came and went, debauched and incompetent. Officials and governors bought and sold their posts to the highest bidder. As the 19th century wore on, the Ottomans slipped ever further into debt and disarray, propped up by loans from European powers, only too happy to hold the scimitar to their throats. With the outbreak of World War I, the end finally came. On the wrong side of history, the empire shattered, carved up by the victorious allies. The Turkish rump, shorn of its Arab lands, was left to reforge itself as a modern nation under Ataturk. But the legacy of the Ottomans endured, etched into the map of the Middle East, echoing in its faith and traditions. For all its flaws and cruelties, there is still something darkly alluring about the Ottoman Empire. A certain romance clings to its name, whispers of Arabian nights, of silken luxury and the languid beauty of the harem. But we must never forget the ugly realities, the cheap regard for human life, the suffering of slaves and peasants, the capricious brutality of despotic rule. The Ottoman Empire was many things, vast, splendid, long-enduring, but it was rarely a good place to be born a subject rather than a sultan. For most, life was an endless struggle, to scratch out an existence, to escape persecution, to eke out some shred of justice or dignity in the shadow of the sublime port. Perhaps there is a lesson there for all great empires, that glory and longevity can mask a multitude of sins, that power and magnificence always come with a human cost. A lesson written on every page of the Ottoman story, whispered by the ghosts of its numberless subjects, toiling and bleeding across the centuries to sustain the grandeur of their masters. The splendor of the Topkapi Palace, the dazzling wealth of the bazaars, the deadly discipline of the Janissaries, all built on the bent backs of peasants, slaves, and persecuted minorities. As the saying goes, at the feast of empire, most dine on scraps and ashes. Yet for 600 years, over a vast swath of the earth, the Ottoman Empire endured, absorbing blow after blow, defying every prophecy of doom. There is a grim majesty in that longevity, a perverse impressiveness in the sheer scope and span of Ottoman power. The Ottoman system, for all its backwardness and brutality, proved remarkably resilient, able to crush dissent, co-opt enemies, and bend millions to its will. It was a staying power purchased through centuries of merciless struggle against Persians and Europeans, against shifting trade routes and technologies, against 100 centrifugal forces straining to tear the empire apart. In the end, of course, those forces prevailed, and the Ottomans crumbled into the dustbin of history. But for 6 long centuries, they held sway over a significant slice of the human race, shaping destinies, leaving their mark on lands and peoples, bending the arc of history to their will. A dubious achievement, perhaps, but an achievement nonetheless in this blood-soaked charnel house we call the human story. Such was the Ottoman Empire, at once squalid and splendid, a realm of exquisite artistry and exquisite agony, of golden ages and unspeakable atrocities, a tragic, tortured, transcendent tale of triumph and collapse, a mirror for the worst and best of our kind. Now, as we close our eyes and drift off to slumber, those old ghosts come whispering back to us. Sultans and slaves, conquerors and concubines, all those long-ago lives ground up in the mills of empire. Their struggles and sorrows float to us across the ages, a blood-flecked miasma from that vanished epoch of silks and scimitars. Perhaps, as we sink into sleep, we might spare them a thought, the faceless, forgotten subjects whose pain paid for the palaces and pashas, the price of all that pomp and power, tallied in toil and torment. Not a comforting thought, perhaps, but an instructive one, as we sail through this fallen world of fading glories and tarnished thrones. For in the rise and ruin of the Ottoman realm, we might just catch a glimpse of the human condition in all its sordid splendor. As the 16th century dawned, the Ottoman Empire was at the zenith of its power and influence. Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire's longest reigning sultan, sat upon the throne in Constantinople. Under his firm hand, Ottoman armies pushed the borders of the empire outward, conquering new lands with ruthless efficiency. The Sultan's vast dominion now stretched across 3 continents. a diverse patchwork of territories home to dozens of ethnic groups, languages, and religions. But for the millions of subjects under the Sultan's rule, life was often difficult and precarious. The empire's very size proved to be one of the greatest challenges for the Ottoman government. Maintaining control and order over such far-flung lands, from the Balkan Mountains to the deserts of Arabia, was a constant struggle. Messages, taxes, and decrees from the Sultan could take weeks or even months to reach the empire's distant provinces. Rough terrain, weather, and sheer distance hindered efforts to project centralized power to the fringes of the empire. Transporting armies, supplies, and commerce over land and sea was an arduous undertaking, at the mercy of the elements. In remote regions, local authorities and power brokers often held more sway than far-off Constantinople. Corruption was rampant, as provincial officials exploited their distance from the capital to line their own pockets and abuse their authority. Bribes, kickbacks, and embezzlement leached away imperial revenue. Justice was selective and uneven. A pasha could easily bend the law to his benefit, with the right incentive slipped to the local judge. The hardships of life were compounded by the empire's location. Much of its territory consisted of unforgiving landscapes prone to droughts, famines, and natural disasters. When the rains failed in Egypt or Anatolia, peasants starved and the Sultan's taxes went unpaid. Locusts could devour whole harvests in a matter of days. Earthquakes, floods, and fires periodically ravaged towns and cities, leaving destitution in their wake. But no force of nature was so feared as the wrath of the Sultan himself. As absolute monarch, the Ottoman ruler wielded power that was nearly divine. The Sultan's word was law, and he held the power of life and death over all his subjects. Dissent, disobedience, and rebellion were dealt with swiftly and brutally to serve as stark warnings against future defiance. Perhaps no one man embodied the ruthlessness of Ottoman justice more than Sultan Selim I, known as Selim the Grim. Though his reign lasted only 8 years, he carved a bloody and merciless path to secure his throne and expand Ottoman power. Selim was never meant to be Sultan. He was the youngest son of Sultan Bayezid II and seemed destined for a quiet life as a provincial governor. But Selim had grander ambitions and a matching appetite for violence to achieve them. As his older brothers fought each other for the right to succeed their father, Selim exploited the divisions to launch his own bid for power. In the cutthroat game of Ottoman succession, princes were expected to murder their own brothers to eliminate rivals. But even by these brutal standards, Selim's rise was especially vicious. He forced his ailing father to abdicate the throne to him, then promptly had Bayezid poisoned to death to avoid any threat of his return. On securing the throne, he ordered the strangulation of his 2 older brothers and 4 of his own nephews, all potential claimants to his rule. Selim's purges extended beyond his own family. He distrusted his father's advisors and commanders, suspecting many of plotting against him. To solidify his grip on power, Selim had over 45,000 people executed across the empire. From powerful statesmen to Shia Muslims, he considered heretics. Among the victims were 2 of Selim's own sons, killed on mere suspicion of disloyalty. Whoever spares the life of a snake will sooner or later be bitten by it, the Sultan coldly declared. With his throne secured in blood, Selim next turned his murderous energies to expanding Ottoman domains. He fixed his eyes on the Mamluk Sultanate, the last great Muslim empire blocking Ottoman domination of the Islamic world. Selim amassed a fearsome army and marched against the Mamluks, declaring it his destiny to reunite the fractured domains of Islam. In 1516, the armies of the Ottomans and Mamluks collided at the Battle of Majdabik in Syria. Selim triumphed against the Mamluk Sultan Al-Ashraf Kansu al-Ghauri, who fell dead on the battlefield, sealing the doom of his dynasty. In the span of a year, Selim's armies overran Mamluk territory in Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and the Arabian Peninsula. For the first time in centuries, the holiest cities of Islam, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, were united under a single Muslim ruler. Selim now styled himself as Caliph, the paramount leader of the entire Islamic world and successor to the Prophet Muhammad. It was a title the Ottoman sultans would claim for the next 400 years until the empire's end. Though Selim the Grim died suddenly just a year after his conquest of the Mamluks, likely from the plague, his brutal reign reshaped the Ottoman Empire and left a fearsome legacy. He vastly expanded Ottoman domains, nearly doubling the size of the empire and setting the stage for it to become a world power. But Selim's notorious cruelty also instilled a culture of fear, suspicion, and brutality in the empire that would endure long after his death. Under Suleiman and subsequent sultans, the Ottoman war machine continued to grind outward, devouring new territories in relentless campaigns of conquest. For the hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the Sultan's armies, military life was full of hardships and dangers. The backbone of the Ottoman army was the Janissaries, elite infantry troops who were among the most disciplined and effective soldiers of their era. But the Janissaries had humble origins, as corps of enslaved Christian boys taken from conquered Balkan lands. Through the practice of devshirme, the Ottomans levied a blood tax on their Christian subjects, taking young boys from their families to be converted to Islam and molded into loyal soldiers. It was a traumatic experience, as the boys were torn from everything they knew and stripped of their former identities. They entered a grueling regimen of training and indoctrination, beaten into obedience and forged into warriors. But after years of hardship, the Janissaries gained a special status and influence in Ottoman society. They were freed upon completing their training and generously paid as elite guardians of the Sultan and shock troops of the empire. In time, their power grew to the point that even sultans were wary of displeasing them. Beyond the Janissaries, life was harsh and unforgiving for the rank and file of the Ottoman military. Soldiers were expected to endure long marches in scorching heat or bitter cold, burdened with heavy packs and weapons. Supplying such large forces was a monumental challenge, and troops often went hungry or fell ill when rations ran short or spoiled. On campaign, the Ottoman army cut a path of destruction across enemy lands, pillaging food, supplies, and valuables from villages in their path. Soldiers were unleashed to rape and enslave civilians as the spoils of war. Conquered towns were sacked, their inhabitants slaughtered or deported if they resisted. The Ottomans' Islamic faith and concept of holy war also colored their military campaigns. Conquests were depicted as a struggle between Muslims and infidels, and Ottoman soldiers were promised paradise if they fell in battle against the Christian enemy. This zealotry fanned the flames of Ottoman aggression and brutality against non-Muslims. But Muslim armies were not spared the terrible realities of Ottoman warfare. As the empire pushed into the Arab world, countries like Persia became the targets of Ottoman belligerents. For 150 years, the Ottomans and Safavid Persian dynasties waged a bitter conflict for supremacy in the Islamic East, a struggle that devolved into sectarianism between the Ottomans' Sunni faith and the Safavids' adherents to Shia Islam. Both sides reviled the other as heretics deserving of death, giving the wars a genocidal fury. Disputed borderlands like the Caucasus Mountains were ravaged and depopulated by the unending raids, invasions, and scorched earth tactics of the Ottomans and Persians. Even when peace treaties were signed, they proved only brief respites before the next round of bloodletting. Such was the fate of tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers consigned to garrison duty in the empire's far-flung frontier outposts. In isolated mountain forts or desert citadels, troops endured a boring, lonely, and often short existence. Supply lines were tenuous and unreliable, and many garrisons were woefully undermanned and under-provisioned. Frontier troops faced the constant threat of raids and ambushes by local insurgents, rival powers, or hostile tribes. many garrisons completely vanished, wiped out to the last man, with no survivors left to tell of their demise. Those lucky enough to complete their deployments in these imperial badlands often emerged broken in body and spirit by the merciless conditions. But while common Ottoman soldiers toiled, suffered, and died by the thousands in the empire's ceaseless wars, their supreme ruler enjoyed a life of extravagant luxury and pleasure behind the walls of his palace. The Ottoman Sultan, whose every whim was law, lived in a world of such splendor and excess that it was scarcely imaginable to his subjects. Topkapi Palace in Constantinople was the glittering heart of the Ottoman Empire, a sprawling compound of ornate buildings, manicured gardens, and lavish courtyards. It was home to the Sultan's imperial court, a city within a city housing thousands of people from the lowliest slaves to the most powerful officials of the Ottoman government. At the center of this opulent world was the Sultan himself, the living personification of Ottoman wealth and might. Surrounded by fawning courtiers and waited on by an army of servants, the Sultan lived a life of idleness and indulgence that was a jarring contrast to the poverty and hardship experienced by most of his subjects. The Sultan's every desire, no matter how depraved or extravagant, was catered to by the empire's strained coffers. He was attended by an endless retinue of slaves who fanned him with peacock-feathered fans, served his meals on bejeweled golden platters, and sprinkled his path with rosewater. A special servant was tasked with dyeing the Sultan's beard with henna, while another oversaw his baths and toiletries. The imperial kitchens worked around the clock to prepare the Sultan's meals, with hundreds of cooks, bakers, and servers churning out a dizzying array of dishes. Mountains of rice pilaf, spit-roasted meats, savory stews, honeyed desserts, and other delicacies were served at each sitting. The kitchen staff was so extensive that even the task of making the Sultan's coffee was divided between 4 different servants. But perhaps no aspect of the Sultan's court was so renowned or shrouded in mystery as his imperial harem. The harem was the secluded private quarters of the palace where the Sultan's hundreds of concubines and female family members lived in pampered seclusion. It was a world unto itself, with its own strict hierarchy, politics, and rituals. The women of the harem were acquired as slaves from all across the empire and beyond, Christian girls taken in conquest, Circassian beauties bought at slave markets, African maidens given as tribute. They were brought to the palace at a young age and schooled in Islam, Turkish language, and palace etiquette to serve the Sultan's pleasure. Only the most beautiful and talented girls were presented to the Sultan for his bedchamber. Those who bore him sons gained special status and influence as mothers of potential heirs to the throne. But even the loftiest concubine was still a slave, her life and destiny wholly owned by the Sultan's whims. The women of the harem were guarded and served by an army of eunuchs, male slaves castrated as boys, to render them unthreatening and obedient. The eunuchs, many of them Africans, were charged with safeguarding the virtue and fidelity of the harem women. They escorted concubines to the Sultan's bed, kept watchful eyes on the harem's occupants, and served as discreet messengers and emissaries to the outside world. The chief black eunuch was one of the most powerful and feared figures in the Ottoman court. As overseer of the imperial harem, he controlled access to the Sultan's ear and could make or break the fortunes of courtiers and officials. Some chief eunuchs amassed such wealth and influence that they rivaled the empire's leading statesmen. Life in the imperial harem, for all its vaunted pleasures and luxuries, was often a gilded cage of loneliness, tedium, and scheming. Cut off from the outside world, the women formed a pressure cooker society rife with jealousies, rivalries, and power plays as they vied for the Sultan's attentions and favor. The mother of the reigning Sultan, known as the Valid Sultan, reigned supreme over this secretive realm, using her iron-fisted authority to control the harem hierarchy and often the empire itself. One of the most remarkable Valida sultans was Hurrem Sultan, a former slave girl who rose to become the beloved wife and most trusted advisor of Suleiman the Magnificent. Born to an Orthodox priest in present-day Ukraine, Hurrem was captured by Crimean Tatars and sold as a slave to the Ottoman court. Her beauty and wit soon caught the eye of Suleiman, and she became his favorite concubine, breaking centuries of tradition by becoming his legal wife. As Hurrem's power grew, she maneuvered to secure the throne for her own son, Selim, over the Sultan's other heirs. Her schemes led to the downfall and execution of the Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, and Suleiman's oldest son and heir apparent Mustafa, who was strangled to death on his father's orders. Hurrem's ruthless machinations ensured that her own bloodline would inherit Suleiman's empire. Hurrem was equally adept at wielding her influence for grand projects and philanthropy. She sponsored the construction of mosques, schools, hospitals and public baths across the empire that still bear her name. Her charity and patronage of the arts and architecture helped usher in the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. But Hurrem's remarkable rise from slave girl to empress would have been unimaginable for the vast majority of women in the Ottoman Empire. For most, life was one of unrelenting drudgery, hardship and subjugation, with few paths out of poverty and oppression. Under Islamic law, as practiced in the Ottoman Empire, women were considered property of their male guardians, whether fathers, brothers, husbands or masters. They had limited rights and freedoms, and their worth was largely determined by their sexual purity and ability to bear children, particularly sons. Marriages were arranged by families, often to much older men, without the consent or desires of the bride being considered. Girls were frequently married off before puberty, and it was considered acceptable for husbands to beat their wives for perceived infractions. Divorce was common, but a ruinous scandal for women, while men had the legal right to marry multiple wives and divorce any for any reason. For rural and lower-class women, a lifetime of difficult labor and repeated pregnancies was the norm. They toiled in the fields, fetched water and firewood, and reared large broods of children with little rest or access to medical care. Domestic violence and abuse was rampant and mostly ignored by authorities. Women had limited opportunities for education or advancement in professions. Though some upper-class women received schooling in language, religion, music and embroidery, female literacy was rare. Women were barred from most trades controlled by male-dominated guilds and could only work in a few acceptable roles like midwifery or wet nursing. Even the clothing women wore reflected their second-class status in Ottoman society. While men were free to wear a range of colours and styles, women were forced to wear concealing outer robes and veils in drab shades. Stepping outside the home without a male escort invited harassment and accusations of indecency. Slavery was widespread and an accepted fact of life in the Ottoman Empire, with women being particularly vulnerable. Markets across the empire openly bought and sold women from Africa, Europe and Asia to serve as household maids, farm workers or concubines. Ottoman armies captured women as spoils of war on their conquests, and many rural families sold daughters they could not afford into bondage. Most female slaves toiled in lowly drudgery, but a small number of exceptionally beautiful or talented girls could hope to be selected for the imperial harem or the households of powerful officials. There they could rise to be favourites, or even legal wives of their masters. But such cases were a lucky few compared to the mass of female slaves who suffered abuse, exploitation, and cruelty at the whims of their owners. Enslaved women had no legal rights or recourse, with rape and corporal punishment being commonly accepted disciplinary measures. Many female slaves died young from overwork, violence, or in childbed. Even the empire's non-Muslim subjects suffered oppression and persecution based on their faith. Though the Ottoman sultans allowed Christians and Jews to practice their religions as people of the book, this tolerance came with a heavy price. Non-Muslims faced harsh restrictions on their rights, social status, and economic opportunities under Ottoman rule. Christians and Jews were considered inferior to Muslims and subject to a special head tax called the jizya as a sign of their submission. As the 19th century drew to a close, the once mighty Ottoman Empire was but a shadow of its former self. Decadence and decay had set in, eating away at the very foundations of the Sultanate. The empire was deeply in debt to the European powers, who were circling like vultures, ready to pick apart the carcass of the dying empire. The sultans of this period were a far cry from the mighty conquerors of old. They were more interested in the pleasures of the harem than in the affairs of state. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who ruled from 1876 to 1909, was a paranoid recluse who rarely left his palace. He was obsessed with the fear of assassination and spent much of his time spying on his own subjects. Meanwhile, the once feared Ottoman army had fallen behind the times. While the European powers were developing new weapons and tactics, the Ottomans were still relying on outdated methods. The Janissaries, once the elite soldiers of the empire, had become a corrupt and undisciplined rabble. They were more interested in extorting money from the populace than in defending the empire. As the military declined, so too did the empire's hold on its vast territories. In the Balkans, Christian subjects who had long chafed under Ottoman rule began to agitate for independence. In 1804, the Serbs rose up against their Ottoman overlords, sparking a series of rebellions that would eventually lead to the creation of an independent Serbian state. The Greeks followed suit in 1821, waging a bloody war of independence that captured the imagination of Europe. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Christendom, was now the sick man of Europe. It was only a matter of time before the empire would be carved up by the great powers. In 1878, following the Russo-Turkish War, the Ottomans were forced to give up vast swathes of territory in the Balkans. Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Romania all gained their independence, while Austria-Hungary occupied Bosnia and Herzegovina. For the ordinary people of the Ottoman Empire, life was a constant struggle. The empire's economy was in shambles and poverty was widespread. In the countryside, peasants toiled under the yoke of oppressive landlords, while in the cities the working classes lived in squalid tenements. Disease was rampant and infant mortality was high. The situation was particularly dire for the empire's minorities. Armenians, Greeks, and other Christian populations suffered persecution and discrimination at the hands of their Muslim overlords. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Ottomans unleashed a series of brutal pogroms against the Armenians, killing tens of thousands and driving many more into exile. As the 20th century dawned, the Ottoman Empire was on its last legs. The final blow came during World War I, when the Ottomans made the fateful decision to side with Germany and the Central Powers. The war was a disaster for the Ottomans, who suffered heavy losses on all fronts. In the Arab lands, the British fomented rebellion, promising the Arabs independence if they rose up against their Ottoman rulers. In 1918, with the empire in chaos and its armies in retreat, the Allies occupied Constantinople. The once great Ottoman Empire had finally collapsed, and its territories were divided up among the victorious powers. The modern nation-states of Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and others rose from the ashes of the empire, but the legacy of Ottoman rule would continue to shape the region for generations to come. For 600 years, the Ottoman Empire had been a dominant force in the world. But for the millions who lived under its rule, life was often brutal and unforgiving. From the splendor of the Sultan's palace to the squalor of the peasant's hut, the story of the Ottoman Empire is one of power, oppression, and the enduring resilience of the human spirit. As we come to the end of our journey through the annals of Ottoman history, we are reminded of the importance of learning from the past. The story of the Ottoman Empire is a cautionary tale, one that speaks to the dangers of unchecked power and the perils of imperial ambition. But it is also a story of hope, of the unquenchable desire for freedom and self-determination that burns within the human heart. So let us take a moment to reflect on the lessons of the Ottoman Empire and to ponder what they might mean for our own time. And as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of a world where the brutality of the past is but a distant memory, and where all people can live in peace, prosperity, and freedom. If you enjoyed this quiet and relaxing look at life in the Ottoman Empire, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. There are many more fascinating stories from history waiting to soothe you to sleep. Until next time, this is your host, bidding you a peaceful and restful good night.